"That can't be her," Ethan said out loud in front of the whole town, and he couldn't take it back. He'd written that letter asking for plain, asking for practical, asking for a woman he would never once be tempted to love. And then the stagecoach door opened and she stepped down, not desperate, not timid, not anything he had built a wall against, and she looked straight at him like she already knew every locked door inside him and had come prepared to wait them out. Ethan Walker had survived 4 years of grief by feeling nothing. She undid it in 10 seconds flat. Subscribe to our channel and follow this story all the way to the end, and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The letter had taken Ethan Walker 3 weeks to write. Not because he struggled with words. He didn't. He'd kept ledgers for 15 years, written contracts, signed deeds, drafted agreements with cattle buyers from 3 different territories. Words on paper were easy. Words on paper didn't look back at you. The trouble was that every time he sat down at the kitchen table with the lamp burning low and his pen in his hand, he'd write a sentence and then sit there staring at it like it had accused him of something. "I am a rancher in Silver Creek, Montana." He crossed that out. Too plain. "I operate a cattle operation of 400 acres in the Bitterroot Valley." He crossed that out too. Too formal. Too much like a deed transfer. He tried again. "I am a man of 35 years who has been alone for longer than I care to say, and I am looking for a woman who understands that some people have already spent everything they had on love and came back empty." He burned that one. In the end, the letter he sent was 8 sentences long. He told the agency his acreage, his cattle count, his income for the previous year. He told them the winters were brutal, and the nearest town was 6 miles by road, longer in mud season. He told them he needed someone capable, someone practical, someone who wasn't going to arrive expecting a comfortable life because Silver Creek didn't offer one, and neither did he. And then at the bottom he wrote the one line that he'd told himself was purely logistical. "Do not send a photograph. I don't want to make this emotional." He mailed it on a Tuesday. By Thursday, he'd talked himself into believing the whole thing was a mistake and nearly rode into town to take it back. His neighbor, an old rancher named Holt Briggs, who'd been married to the same woman for 31 years and never let Ethan forget it, had been the one to talk him into the arrangement in the first place. Holt had found him one September evening, sitting on the porch steps with his boots off and his eyes somewhere else entirely, and Holt had sat down beside him without being invited and said, "You're going to work yourself to death out here, Ethan. Not from the cattle, from the quiet." Ethan hadn't answered. A man wasn't built to carry a place this size alone. I'm not talking about ranch hands. I'm talking about someone at the table, someone across the room. I had that. I know you did. The silence between them stretched out long enough to be its own kind of conversation. The wind moved through the grass. Somewhere in the distance, one of the horses shifted in the corral and blew a long breath through its nose. "She's been gone 4 years, Holt finally said. 3 years and 8 months. Holt looked at him sideways. "That ain't the same as 4 years. "No," Ethan said. "It's not." He didn't write the letter for another 2 months after that, but he wrote it. The stagecoach from Billings came through Silver Creek every Tuesday and Friday. On the Friday in question, Ethan arrived at the station 40 minutes early, which he'd told himself was because he had a supply order to collect from the depot, and not because he was nervous. He wasn't nervous. He was practical. He'd made a practical decision, and he was going to handle it practically the way he handled everything, which meant arriving prepared and leaving emotion out of it. He tied his horse to the post outside Hendrix's Dry Goods and walked to the station platform and stood with his arms crossed and his hat pulled down and his face arranged into the expression that most of the people in Silver Creek recognized as Ethan Walker's version of a greeting. Word had gotten around because word always got around in a town with 240 people and 1 telegraph office. Ethan knew it had gotten around because of the way people were positioned on that platform. Lena Cahill from the boarding house was there, which made sense since she had a room rented for the new arrival. But Earl Poole was there, and Earl Poole had no business at the station on a Friday afternoon unless he was waiting to see something worth seeing. Martha Hendricks had found a reason to stand near her husband's store window, where she had a clear view of the platform. Two of the Tanner boys were sitting on a feed barrel pretending to be bored in a way that only worked on people who had never been 16. Ethan ignored all of them. He looked down the road in the direction the stage would come, and he breathed slowly, and told himself it didn't matter what she looked like or who she was, because this was a contract, not a romance, and he was 35 years old, and had already been in love once, and knew exactly what that cost a man, and wasn't willing to pay it again. He was still telling himself that when the stagecoach appeared at the end of Main Street, trailing a plume of summer dust. The driver pulled up hard, and the horses came to a stamping, blowing stop, and the platform filled with the ordinary noise of arrival luggage being handed down, the creak of springs, the coachman calling out the name of the town. Two passengers stepped out first. An older man in a traveling coat who Ethan didn't recognize. A young woman with a baby on her hip who turned out to be returning to her family from a visit to her sister in Billings. The baby cried. The mother cooed at it. The crowd on the platform sorted itself by business. And then the coach door opened a second time. Ethan wasn't looking directly at it. He was watching the driver hand down a trunk that he was fairly certain was larger than anything practical, and he was calculating the logistics of getting it onto a wagon when the platform went quiet. In a particular way, not completely silent, but that specific quiet, when a room or a crowd shifts its attention all at once to one point without meaning to. He looked up. She was standing on the coach step, one hand on the doorframe, looking at the platform with an expression that wasn't timid and wasn't theatrical. She was simply reading it. Taking inventory. Her traveling dress was the color of pine needles, dark and practical, and it was covered in the fine, pale dust of 2 days on a stage road, and she had dark hair pinned up beneath a plain hat with no decoration on it, and she was carrying her own suitcase, not waiting for anyone to hand it to her, and she was nothing like what he'd imagined. He didn't know what he'd imagined exactly. Something smaller, something softer, something that would look at him with that particular quality of gratitude that he'd always associated with desperation. Because that was what he'd told himself. He was getting into a practical arrangement with a woman who needed security and was willing to work for it. This woman was not looking at anyone with gratitude. She stepped down from the coach with the careful ease of someone who'd been on rough roads before and had learned to trust her own footing, and she set her suitcase down on the platform, and she looked around at the town of Silver Creek, Montana, and something in her face registered it the way a person registers a place they're deciding whether they can live in. Not was she welcome. Could she stay? Ethan's mouth opened. That can't be her. He hadn't meant to say it out loud. He'd have bet money he hadn't said it out loud, except that Earl Poole, standing 2 feet to his left, very clearly heard it, because Earl Poole bit down on a grin and turned away, which was the most diplomatic thing Earl Poole had done in a decade. The woman's eyes moved across the platform and found him, and Ethan Walker, who had not been rattled by a human being standing still since the last bad winter, felt his entire prepared speech walk out of his head and not come back. Her name, she told him, was Clara Bennett, formerly of Wichita, Kansas. She said this plainly, the way a person states a fact they have no need to apologize for, while she stood on the Silver Creek platform with her suitcase at her feet, and the afternoon light coming down hard, and the whole town pretending not to stare. Ethan got his speech back in pieces. I'm Ethan Walker. I know. He didn't know how she knew, since he'd never sent a photograph either. But she said it like she'd known for some time, which made him feel observed in a way he wasn't accustomed to. The wagon's over on 2nd Street, he said. If you've got more luggage. Just the one case in the trunk. I'll get the trunk. I can manage the case. I didn't say you couldn't. She looked at him for a moment. Something in her face was reading something in his, and he didn't know what it found, but she didn't look away first. Mr. Walker, she said, I imagine you've spent the last 10 minutes on this platform talking yourself into being reasonable about this. His jaw tightened. I don't know what you mean. I think you do. She picked up her suitcase. I've done the same thing myself for the last 2 days on that coach. Talked myself into being practical, into not expecting anything, into treating this like what it is. He waited. Only I couldn't figure out what it is, she said. So I stopped trying. I'm here. You're here. We're both reasonable people. The rest of it we can work out. It was, he would think later, the most unsettling thing anyone had ever said to him in his life, because it was entirely reasonable. And because she said it with a kind of steady calm that was not the same as coldness and not the same as distance, but was something he couldn't immediately name, something that reminded him in a way he refused to examine closely of the quality he had most loved in his wife. Clarity. She had always said exactly what she meant, and it had wrecked him when she was gone. He picked up the trunk. He carried it to the wagon without another word. Lena Cahill had the boarding house room prepared, which meant Clara would stay in town for 1 week. That had been Ethan's arrangement with the agency, a trial period, a practical pause before the formal part. And Ethan would ride out each day, and Clara could decide if the ranch was something she could bear, and Ethan could decide if Clara was something he could manage, and neither of them was obligated to pretend otherwise. That was the plan. Clara lasted 4 hours at the boarding house before she asked Lena Cahill for directions to the Walker Ranch. Lena told her it was 6 miles north. Clara asked if there was a horse she could borrow, or a wagon making a delivery. Lena stared at her. You just got off a 2-day stage ride. I know, Clara said. I'd like to see where I'm going to be living. Mr. Walker said 1 week. Mr. Walker said a trial period. He didn't say I had to spend it in town. She picked up her suitcase. Is there a wagon or not? There was. Tom Briggs Holt's oldest boy was heading out past the Walker place late that afternoon with a load of feed. Lena told Clara this with the expression of someone who had given up trying to contain a natural event. Tom Briggs. When Clara appeared at his wagon and introduced herself and asked for a ride, said nothing at all for a full 5 seconds. Then he said, "Yes, ma'am," and moved a feed sack to make room on the bench seat. They were a mile out of town before he found his voice. Ethan know you're coming. He will, Clara said. Tom Briggs looked at the road ahead for another long moment and then said, "Yes, ma'am," again this time with a slightly different quality, like he was talking to himself. Bachuo. Ethan was in the barn when he heard the wagon. He assumed it was Tom with the feed order he'd placed last week, so he was already walking toward the barn door, wiping his hands on a rag, when he stepped outside and saw the two of them on the wagon seat and stopped walking. Tom gave him a small apologetic wave. Clara got down from the wagon bench before Tom had fully stopped it the way she'd gotten off the stagecoach, trusting her own footing, and she picked up her suitcase from the wagon bed and looked at the ranch house and the barn and the corral and the hills beyond, and she took it all in with the same deliberate reading she'd applied to the Silver Creek platform. Ethan found his voice. The arrangement was 1 week in town. I know what the arrangement was. Then why? Because I wanted to see it. She turned to look at him. I'm not making a decision about spending my life somewhere I haven't seen. Are you? He opened his mouth. He closed it again. Tom Briggs was suddenly very interested in unloading feed bags by himself. You could have waited until... Ethan. She said his name for the first time, and something about the way she said it, like it was simply a fact, like Montana or cattle or 400 acres, stopped him. I'm not here to follow a schedule that makes this easier to ignore. I'm here to find out if this is real. If you're real. If this place is somewhere I can actually live and work and be useful. I can't do that from a boarding house 6 miles away. A pause. Can I see the house? Silence. Behind him, Tom Briggs dropped a feed bag and then immediately bent to pick it up. Ethan turned toward the house and said, "It needs work." I assumed. The kitchen is functional. The back room isn't. All right. There's a spare room at the end of the hall. It's small. I don't need large. He walked to the house. She walked beside him, not behind him. He noticed that. Dang. The house was exactly what he'd told her. Functional. Sparse. Built for a man who had stopped caring whether he was comfortable. The kitchen had a good iron stove and a work table and shelves that needed organizing. The main room had a fireplace, a worn settee, a bookshelf half full of ranching manuals, and one Bible. The floor was clean because Ethan was disciplined about cleanliness, the way he was disciplined about everything as a defense against chaos rather than out of any interest in comfort. Clara walked through it slowly. She didn't comment on the curtainless windows. She didn't remark on the absence of anything that could be called decoration. She went to the kitchen first and opened the cold larder and looked at what was inside, and then she closed it and went to the stove and opened the firebox and checked the flue. "Who's been cooking?" she asked. "I have." "What?" "Mostly." She looked at the larder again and then at him. "Mostly what?" "Mostly things that don't require much time. Salt pork and biscuits." He didn't answer. She was right. "Do you have a garden?" "I have the space for one." "I'll need seeds. I can write a list." She said, "I'll need the way someone says it who has already decided they're staying. Not we could or you might want." He noticed that too, and said nothing about it, because he didn't know whether to correct it or not. And by the time he'd decided he couldn't correct something that was probably just practical planning, and not any kind of announcement, she was already at the end of the hallway, looking at the spare room. "This is fine," she said. "It's the smallest room." "I said it's fine, Ethan." She set her suitcase inside the door. "I'll get the rest from the wagon." He was already moving past her. "I'll get it." "I carried it here." "Clara." He stopped. It was the first time he'd used her name. It sat in the air between them, plain and strange at the same time, like something he'd set down and couldn't decide whether to pick up again. "I'll get it." She looked at him for a moment. "Thank you," she said, and it wasn't grateful the way he'd expected gratitude to sound. It was even, like one professional to another. He went to get the trunk. "Sir." Tom Briggs left before dark, and Ethan fed the horses, and Clara cooked dinner. He hadn't asked her to. He came in from the corral to find her at the stove with her sleeves pushed up and her jacket hung on the hook by the door, and there were potatoes frying in the cast-iron pan, and something that smelled like dried herbs she had apparently found somewhere on the kitchen shelf that Ethan had forgotten he owned. He stopped in the kitchen doorway. "You didn't have to—" "I know. I was going to make salt pork and biscuits," she said. He looked at the pan. The potatoes were browning correctly. She'd found the dried rosemary he'd been given by Holt's wife 2 years ago and never touched. He sat down at the kitchen table. Neither of them said much during dinner. That could have been uncomfortable. It wasn't exactly. It was more like two people calibrating, measuring the distance between them, and deciding silently whether it was workable. After dinner, Clara washed the dishes without comment, and Ethan dried them because standing there watching her seemed rude, and they put them away, and she said goodnight, and went to the small room at the end of the hall, and he stood in the kitchen for a long time afterwards, not sure what to do with the fact that the house felt different. Not better necessarily. Different. Like a window had been opened. The week passed faster than he expected, which was itself a kind of surprise because time in a house alone stretched. He'd learned that the hard way in the year after Sarah and the boy. A week alone could feel like a month. A morning alone could feel like a week. You learned to fill it with work, with movement, with tasks that had clear ends because the silence could swallow you if you let it. Clara didn't fill the silence. She didn't work to be cheerful. She didn't perform. But she worked, and working alongside someone changed the texture of the days. She was up before him, which he discovered Tuesday morning when he came into the kitchen at first light and found the fire already lit and coffee on. She was at the table, with a piece of paper and a stub of pencil, making a list. He looked at the paper. "What's that?" "Inventory. I went through the cold larder and the dry storage after dinner last night." "You went through my—" "You need to know what you have. The cornmeal's nearly gone. You're low on salt. There are 3 tins back there that are bulged on the top and need to be thrown out before someone gets sick." She looked up. "Also, you have a leak in the back wall of the larder where the cold air's been getting in and spoiling things faster than it should. Ethan pulled out a chair and sat down. He looked at the list. It was thorough. I wasn't aware of the tins, he admitted. I know. That's why I wrote it down. He poured himself coffee. She went back to her writing. He looked at the list again and saw at the bottom, in smaller letters, window in northeast bedroom, letting in water, check roof above it. Fence post on west side of corral, leaning frost heave, needs resetting before it falls. 3 cattle in south pasture showing signs of respiratory distress, notified, treated. He looked up fast. Which 3 cattle? 2 black baldies and a red heifer. They were in the southeast corner of the south pasture when I walked it yesterday morning. You walked the south pasture? It's 2 miles, Ethan, not the Pacific Ocean. She took a drink of her coffee. Are they being treated? I noticed one of them coughing last week. I didn't. He stopped. He'd told himself he'd check again this week. He hadn't. I'll go this morning. I'll come. You don't need to. I grew up riding with my father on his medical calls. Animals and people have more in common than most people want to admit. She stood up, taking her coffee with her. I know what respiratory infection looks like in cattle. I'll come. He didn't argue, partly because she was already moving toward her jacket on the hook by the door, and partly because for the first time in a very long while, the idea of not going somewhere alone felt less like a complication and more like something else, something he didn't have a word for yet. The 3 cattle were sick, not critically. Early stage, Clara confirmed, which was fortunate. She crouched down by the red heifer in the pasture grass and checked the animal's eyes and breathing and lymph nodes under the jaw with the same efficient calm she brought to everything, and she told him what she saw and what it meant and what needed to happen, and she was right about all of it. Ethan had been ranching for 15 years. His wife Sarah had known nothing about cattle. She'd grown up in a river town. She'd learned what she could, and she'd been brave about it, and he had loved her completely, and she'd never once walked into a sick pasture and told him what was wrong with his animals before he'd asked. Clara wasn't Sarah. He didn't want her to be. But there was something about watching a woman crouch in the grass and correctly diagnose a bovine respiratory infection before breakfast that recalibrated certain things he had not expected to be recalibrated. You've done this before, he said. My father was a traveling doctor, rural Kansas. When there were no people to see, he doctored animals. She stood wiping her hands on her skirt. I traveled with him from the time I was 9 until I was 22. You learn what illness looks like. It doesn't matter so much what species it is. What happened when you were 22? She was quiet for a moment. He died, she said simply. And I was on my own. A pause. I was married briefly, 3 years. My husband passed as well from fever. I was 26. She looked at him with that steady reading quality. Is that the kind of information you needed to know before you decided? He had not thought about needing to know her history. He realized, standing in the south pasture with 3 sick cattle and the morning light coming flat across the grass, that he had been so focused on managing his own history that he hadn't considered she had one. I'm sorry, he said. It came out rougher than he intended. About your husband. And I'm sorry about yours. She paused. Your wife and your son. Holt Briggs mentioned it yesterday when I stopped to ask about the pasture layout. He felt the familiar clench. 4 years and 3 months of practice at not showing it. 3 years and 8 months, he said. Clara looked at him. That's what I said when Holt told me 4 years. He explained, not sure why he was explaining. That's not the same as 4 years. She was quiet for a long moment. No, she said finally, and there was something in her voice that recognized the distinction without pitying it. It's not. They stood in the south pasture with the sick cattle and the morning light, and he noticed that she didn't say anything else, didn't push, didn't offer comfort he hadn't asked for. She simply turned back to the heifer and told him what medication she'd need and where in the territory he could source it. It was somehow more comforting than comfort would have been. On Thursday of that first week, Nathaniel Crow came to town. Ethan was at Hendrix's dry goods collecting supplies when he heard the name first from Martha Hendrix, who mentioned it the way people mention weather, as something coming from outside that will affect everyone, regardless of their plans, and then from Earl Poole, who came in for tobacco and said, "Crow's got a surveyor with him this time." Ethan looked up from his list. What kind of surveyor? The kind with equipment and papers and a man in a good coat standing next to him writing things down. Earl lit his pipe. They were out on the road north of your place this morning, near the river bend. The river bend. Ethan knew exactly what was at the river bend. The western edge of his property ran 300 yards east of the bend. There had been a boundary question years ago that had been settled by the county. He had the papers. "Crow's got no business at that bend," he said. "I know that," Earl said. "You know that. Whether Crow knows that is a different question." Ethan paid for his supplies. He was heading for the door when Martha Hendrix said quietly, "He also had someone from the Territorial Land Office with him, Ethan." He stopped with his hand on the door. "That right. The one from Billings. I recognized him. He came through last spring on the Henderson matter." The Henderson matter had not ended well for the Hendersons. Ethan walked back to the ranch with his supplies and found Clara in the garden plot she'd already marked out behind the house with stakes and string on her knees in the dirt, turning soil with a hand tool, and he stood at the edge and said, "You said you traveled with a doctor who handled legal claims." She sat back on her heels and looked up at him. "I said I traveled with a doctor. Legal claims are different." "But you know something about it." "I know something about a lot of things." She took off her garden gloves. "Why?" He told her about Crow, about the surveyor, about the land office man. She listened without interrupting, which was not something he'd expected from her, because she had opinions and expressed them. But she had also, he was learning the capacity to be completely still and absorbing when the information required it. When he finished, she stood up. "Do you have your deed?" she asked. "In the house." "Get it. I want to look at the boundary description." He got it. She sat at the kitchen table and read the deed with the same focused attention she'd applied to his supply inventory, her finger moving along the legal description of the boundary lines, and she asked him 2 questions about the survey markers and one about the date of the county settlement, and then she looked up. "Who settled the boundary dispute originally?" "County commissioner, fellow named Adkins. He's been dead 6 years. "Is the settlement documented at the county seat?" "It should be." "Should be or is?" He thought about it. "I have a copy here. Whether they have the original recorded there, I couldn't say for certain." Clara's expression didn't change, but something behind her eyes sharpened. "That," she said, "is what he's banking on." Ethan looked at her. "Nathaniel Crow," she said, "is not here with a surveyor because he doesn't know where your boundary is. He knows exactly where it is. He's here with a surveyor because he's planning to claim the record doesn't exist, and if the county seat doesn't have it filed, his claim has a foothold." She set the deed down. "This is not the first time he's done this." "How do you know?" "Because it's too organized. A man doesn't arrive with a land office representative the first time he tests a boundary. He only brings that kind of weight when he already knows which document he needs to be missing." She stood. "Has anyone in this valley had trouble with him before?" Ethan thought of 2 names immediately. She saw it in his face. "We need to talk to them," she said. "We," he noticed. Not "you should" or "you might want to." "We." He was still working out what to do with that word when she went to get her jacket from the hook by the door. That night, after they'd ridden to visit the Garrity family 2 miles east and heard what had happened to their northern pasture the previous spring after they'd ridden home in the dark with the kind of quiet between them that comes from shared concern, rather than shared distance, after Clara had made coffee and they'd sat at the kitchen table with the deed spread out and her notes alongside it, Ethan said, "Why did you really come here?" She looked up. "I answered a letter." "You could have answered letters from a dozen places. Men with more money. Men with easier lives." "Yes." "So why Montana? Why a cattle ranch with a man who told the agency not to send a photograph? Clara wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. Because of that line, she said. He waited. Do not make this emotional. You wrote that. I did. Only a man who is completely emotional would write that. She looked at him steadily. A man who doesn't care about something doesn't have to tell someone not to make it into something. He just, she paused, doesn't care. A beat. You cared. You cared so much it frightened you. And I thought that was a man worth knowing. Ethan said nothing. The lamp burned low between them. That's either a reasonable judgment, he said finally, or a considerable gamble. Most worthwhile things are both, she said. She collected the deed and her notes and said goodnight. He sat at the table for a long time after. Outside, the Montana night was wide and deep and full of stars he'd stopped looking at. He looked at them now, and somewhere beneath the familiar armor of self-sufficiency and discipline, and 3 years and 8 months of protected solitude, something shifted. Small, cautious, careful like the first hint of warmth after a winter that had gone on too long. He didn't name it. He wasn't ready to name it, but he didn't put it out either. He found her note on the kitchen table at 4:30 in the morning. Ethan had come down early the way he always did before first light, before the ranch demanded anything of him, and he could have 10 minutes of silence with his coffee. But the fire was already lit, the coffee was already made, and Clara was gone. The note said, went to check the south pasture cattle, back before breakfast. He stood in the kitchen holding the piece of paper and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Outrun. He'd been outrun by a woman who'd arrived 4 days ago and already knew his land better than he wanted to admit. He took his coffee and went to the barn and saddled his horse and rode out after her, telling himself it was because she didn't know the south pasture well enough to be out there alone in the dark, and not because he'd woken up and found the house empty and not liked it. He found her at the south fence. She was crouched beside the red heifer, her hand on the animal's flank. Her ear tilted slightly, the way a person listens to something they're trying to read. The sky above them was the deep gray blue of the half hour before sunrise, that color that isn't night and isn't day, that exists purely as transition. She heard him coming and didn't startle. Her breathing's better, Clara said without looking up. The other two are worse. He got down from the horse, crouched beside her, checked the heifer himself, and then moved to the 2 black baldies and confirmed what she'd said. She was right. The 2 males had deteriorated overnight. I need to ride to Garrity's and borrow his medical kit, he said. He keeps the sulfur compound. I know what they need. Clara stood. I wrote it in my notes last night. I can ride to Garrity's. You don't know the road to Garrity's. You could describe it. Clara. She looked at him. I'll go, he said. You stay with them. Something crossed her face. Not quite argument. More like recalculation, the expression of someone deciding whether this particular hill was worth it. Fine, she said. But Ethan, the 2 males need treatment within 3 hours. Not 4. 3. He was already back on his horse. I heard you. He rode hard to Garrity's and back, and when he returned, she had the 2 sick cattle separated from the rest of the herd and had somehow rigged a temporary enclosure using rope from the fence post, and 2 stakes she'd driven into the ground by hand, and she was sitting on the top rail of the main fence, watching the animals with the patience of someone who had spent years watching things she couldn't rush. He handed her the medical kit without a word. She worked on the first animal, and he worked on the second, and they traded tools back and forth without needing to talk about it one-handing, while the other held both of them, reading what the animal needed and responding to each other's movements, the way people do when they've been working together much longer than 4 days. When it was done, Clara washed her hands from the canteen she'd brought and looked at the sky, which had gone from that blue-gray to full pale morning gold. When's the last time you lost cattle to respiratory? She asked. Winter of 79, 8 head. Because you were alone. It wasn't a question. He answered it anyway. Because I couldn't be in 3 places at once. She dried her hands and looked at him. You've been managing this place like a man who expects to fail, she said. not unkindly. The way a doctor states a diagnosis, not to wound, but because naming it is the first step. You're watching everything get slightly worse, and telling yourself it's manageable until it isn't. His jaw tightened. I've kept this ranch going for 15 years. I know you have. I'm not saying you haven't. She folded the cloth and put it back in the kit. I'm saying you've been surviving it, not running it. He wanted to argue. He opened his mouth to argue, and then standing there in the south pasture with 3 sick cattle that were alive because she'd caught it early, and told him directly he found he didn't have an argument that held up. That's a hard thing to say to a man at sunrise, he said finally. Would you prefer I said it at noon? Something caught in his chest. It wasn't quite a laugh. He hadn't laughed in... He couldn't calculate how long. But whatever it was, it startled him, this small, involuntary movement in his ribcage, like something that had been locked, shaking itself loose for a second before going still again. Clara noticed it. She said nothing, but she noticed. They were back at this house by 8. She made breakfast, real breakfast eggs and salt pork, and the biscuits she'd started making with a recipe she'd apparently carried in her head from Kansas. And they ate at the kitchen table with the deed still spread at one end and her notes at the other. And it occurred to Ethan that this table had not had 2 people at it in 3 years and 8 months, and that it didn't feel as foreign as he'd expected it to. It felt like the table again, instead of a surface to set things on. Tell me about Crow, Clara said between bites. He told her what he knew. Crow had arrived in the territory 18 months ago from somewhere back east Chicago, people said, or maybe St. Louis. Nobody was entirely sure. He had money enough to buy the largest building on Silver Creek's Main Street and convert it into a land office of his own invention, which had no official standing, but looked official enough to confuse people who didn't know the difference. He'd moved against 2 ranches in the first year. The Hendersons had lost 40 acres of river-adjacent land before they understood what was happening. The Garrities had nearly lost their entire water access. What stopped him with the Garrities? Clara asked. Old man Garrity had a cousin in the territorial government who made noise. Ethan drank his coffee. Crow backed off, but he found another angle 6 months later, and they ended up settling for less than what they had. And the Hendersons? Gone. The word sat there. Clara's fork stopped moving. They left. They didn't see a way to stay. Crow tied them up in a boundary dispute for 8 months. Legal fees. The uncertainty scared off the buyer for their cattle. By the time they had a decision that went their way, they'd spent everything fighting for it. Ethan set down his coffee cup. Winning didn't save them. Clara was quiet for a moment, her food untouched. He recognized the look she was doing what she did in the south pasture, the still and absorbing, taking something in completely before she responded to it. He doesn't want to win in court, she said. No. He wants to win before court. He wants to make the fight expensive enough that people give up. She looked at Ethan. Which means if you fight him the way the Hendersons did, you lose the same way they did. I know. So what's the move? He looked at her across the table. This woman he'd known for 4 days. This woman who had walked his south pasture at 4 in the morning and correctly read his deed boundary and already knew the names of 2 families Crow had targeted. This woman who used the word we the way other people breathed. I don't know yet, he said. I have some ideas, she said. I figured. Do you want to hear them? Not yet. He stood and collected the plates. Tell me tonight. I need to think first. Clara watched him take the dishes to the counter. She had, he noticed, learned already not to push when he said not yet. She had some instinct for the difference between avoidance and processing, and she treated them differently. He wasn't sure when she'd learned it. He wasn't sure when he'd noticed she'd learned it. Tonight then, she said, and went to get her garden gloves. Holt Briggs came by at noon. He always came by at noon when there was something he wanted to discuss, that he didn't want to seem to be making a special trip for, because Holt had been Ethan's nearest neighbor for 12 years, and in that time had developed an elaborate system of casual appearances that both of them understood were not casual. He found Ethan replacing the leaning corral post that Clara had noted in her inventory. He stood watching for a moment, then offered to hold the post steady, which was the Holt-Briggs version of a greeting. "Heard Clara showed up 2 days early," Holt said, holding the post. "She did. Heard she rode out to the Garrities yesterday to ask about Crow." Ethan drove the post. "She rode out with me. Tom says she drove him about half crazy on the wagon ride out here the day she arrived. Tom needs to stop telling things to people." Holt was quiet for a moment, the comfortable quiet of a man who has been friends with another man long enough to know what silences mean. Then, "What do you think of her?" Ethan drove the post twice more. "She's competent," he said. "That's it. She diagnosed 3 sick cattle this morning before I was out of bed." Ethan, "What?" "I asked what you think of her, not what she's done." He tamped the soil down around the post and tested it with both hands. Solid. "I don't know yet," he said. Holt made a sound that wasn't quite a comment. "She goes through my supply inventory like it's a survey," Ethan said. "She asks questions I haven't thought to ask. She told me this morning I've been surviving this ranch instead of running it." He paused. "And she was right, which is the most irritating part." Holt bit down on his grin for the second time in a week. "She sounds terrible." "Don't. I'm just saying." "Holt." Ethan picked up the tools. "She's been here 4 days." "I know how long she's been here." "Then don't make it into something it isn't yet." Yet. He hadn't meant to say that word. He could see from the way Holt's expression settled that Holt had noticed it too, and was choosing with the restraint of a man who valued this friendship not to say anything about it. But the word was there. It had come out of his mouth without permission, and the honest thing, the thing he couldn't have avoided if he'd tried, was that it had come out because it was accurate. Yet. He put the tools away and went to find Clara. She was in the back room. The back room was the one he'd told her was unusable. It was the room that had been a long time ago, a room for a child. He didn't go in there. He hadn't gone in there in 3 years and 8 months. He kept the door closed the way you keep a door closed on something you're not ready to open. Clara didn't know that. He stopped in the hallway. The door was open. Clara was inside. She had the window open and was examining the wall beneath it, her hand pressed against the plaster, feeling for the moisture damage he'd mentioned. She had a candle in her other hand, checking the extent of it. She heard him stop. She turned. She looked at his face and understood immediately that something was wrong, and the candle went still in her hand, and she said very quietly, "I'm sorry. I should have asked first." He stood in the doorway. He had not been in this room since the week after the accident, when he'd come in and stood in the middle of it and understood that he was never going to get the thing back that had lived in here, and he'd closed the door and not opened it again. "It's all right," he said. His voice was steady. He had 15 years of practice at steady. "It's not," she said. "I didn't ask. I should have asked." "You said the back room needed looking at." Ethan. He looked at the room. He let himself look at it, which was different from just being in the hallway with the door open. There was almost nothing in it now. He'd removed everything in that first year. The room was just walls and floor, and a window letting in water, and a woman with a candle who was looking at him with complete attention and no pity, which was the only kind of looking he could have stood. "My son was 4, he said, when they went." The words came out measured and spaced like stones being set. Sarah had taken him into town. It was a Friday in November. The bridge over Lyle Creek. He stopped. The boards were rotten. Nobody knew. Clara said nothing. She just held the candle and was still. "They found the wagon. They found—" He stopped again. Drew a breath. "I kept this room closed because opening it was the same as admitting it was true, which I knew it was. But there's knowing a thing, and there's walking into the room." "I understand," Clara said. "You lost someone." "Yes." "So you know." "Yes." A pause. "I know that sometimes the room isn't the room. It's everything that isn't there anymore." Her voice was gentle in a way that was not soft. It was the gentleness of something structural, like good timber. "I'll fix the wall for you, Ethan, if you want. And then it can be whatever you decide to make it." He looked at the room one more time. Then he looked at her. "The wall should be fixed," he said. "All right. But it doesn't need to be anything else right now." "No," she agreed. "It doesn't." He stepped back from the doorway. She followed him out and pulled the door gently closed, and they went back to the kitchen, and he poured them both coffee, and they sat down, and she didn't say another word about the room, and he was grateful in a way that sat too deep for language. The trouble started the next morning. He was riding the north boundary when he saw the stakes. 4 of them, wooden, driven into the ground at intervals, each with a piece of orange ribbon tied at the top. They were on the wrong side of the property marker. Not by much, 10 yards 15, but they were his land, and someone had staked them during the night. Ethan sat on his horse and looked at those stakes for a long moment. Then he pulled them out of the ground, every one of them, and rode back to the house fast. Clara was on the porch with her morning coffee when he came in hard and got down from the horse without tying it first, which told her everything about his state before he said a word. "He staked my north boundary," Ethan said. Her expression didn't panic. It landed in that still and absorbing place. "How many stakes?" 4, 10 to 15 yards inside my line." "Did you pull them?" "Yes." She set down her coffee. "That might complicate." "I know, but I wasn't going to leave his stakes on my land." "No," she said. "I wouldn't have either." She was already standing. "Come inside. I need to write some things down before we do anything else." At the kitchen table, Clara laid out what she knew in a sequence that was more organized than anything Ethan had put together in his head, which was saying something because Ethan was not a disorganized man. The stakes, she said, were not a legal action. They were a provocation. Crow had put them there hoping Ethan would react violently. Confront his men, create an altercation, do something that Crow's lawyer could use to paint him as the aggressor in the dispute. The staking was theater. The real action was what came with it. "He'll file something at the county seat within the week," she said. "A formal claim of encroachment claiming you've been using land that he now asserts is under dispute. He'll cite the survey from yesterday as evidence. He'll present it as a legitimate land question. And my deed. Your deed is real, but he's going to argue that the boundary settlement with Commissioner Adkins was never properly recorded." She looked at him. "Was it—" "I have the copy." "Ethan, was it filed at the county seat?" He looked at his hands. "I believe so," he said. "But Adkins handled it. I trusted him." The word trusted sat in the air. Clara wrote something in her notes. "I need to get to the county seat," she said. "Helena's 3 days' ride." "I know where Helena is." "Clara, if the filing exists, we're fine. We present it, and Crow's claim dies before it starts." She looked up. "If it doesn't exist, we have a problem, and I need to know which one we're dealing with before he files his claim. Whoever files first controls the narrative." He stared at her. "You're talking about riding 3 days to Helena alone. You can't go. If you leave this land unoccupied right now, he'll have men on it before you're a day out." Her voice was even factual, relentless. "I can go. I'm not the owner of record. He has no reason to watch me. You've been in Silver Creek for less than a week. I know the road to Helena. It's the main territorial road, Ethan. It's not wilderness." She paused. "I can handle it." He looked at her. 3 days there, 3 days back. A woman alone on a territorial road with documents that Nathaniel Crow would very much like to see not exist. "No," he said. She put her pen down. "No," he said again, quieter. "Not because I think you can't handle it. Because I'm not sending you into that alone. If something happened—" He stopped. The word hung. Something. Clara watched his face. "We find another way," he said. "Together." The word came out with a weight he hadn't intended. Or maybe he had. He couldn't entirely tell anymore. She picked her pen back up. Her face was composed, but something in it had shifted very slightly, the way a landscape shifts when the light changes. Same hills, different quality. "All right," she said. "Together. Then here's what I think we do." They rode to the Garrities that afternoon. Old man Garrity, who was 64 and had lost 40 acres and his left index finger to a thresher at different points in his life, and seemed to regard both with equal philosophical acceptance, listened to what Clara laid out with his arms crossed and his eyes moving back and forth between her and Ethan. When she finished, he said, "You figured all this out in a week?" "5 days, Clara said. "You were a doctor's daughter." "Yes, I thought doctors' daughters read books and played piano." "My father didn't have a piano," Clara said. "He had legal records and medical texts and a wagon that broke down regularly, and I learned to deal with all three." Garrity looked at Ethan. "I like her better than I liked Sarah," he said. Ethan's jaw went rigid. "That came out wrong," Garrity said immediately. "Yes, it did," Ethan said. "I mean, she's—" Garrity looked at Clara. "Sarah was a fine woman. She was warm and good. But she wasn't—" He waved a hand at Clara generally. "This—" "I'm not sure whether that's a compliment," Clara said. "It is. I promise it is." He uncrossed his arms. "What do you need from me?" "The records from your dispute with Crow. The original filings, whatever you have. And I need you to write down in your own words the sequence of events, exactly as it happened. Dates, names, what was said. What for? Because I believe you're not the only one he's done this to, and if I'm right, a pattern is more powerful than a single complaint." She looked at him steadily. "And because you deserve to get something back from what he took from you." Garrity was quiet for a moment. "You planning to take this somewhere?" he asked. "Eventually," Clara said. "Where?" "Territorial Land Commission. If I can build the right case." Ethan looked at her. She had not said this to him before. Not the Land Commission, not the larger picture she was apparently already seeing. Garrity pulled at his beard. "That's ambitious." "It is," Clara agreed. "Do you have the records?" He stood up. "I'll get them." Ethan waited until Garrity went into the back of the house before he turned to Clara and said low, "The Land Commission?" "Yes." "That's a territorial action. That's what it would need to be. He's done this across at least 3 properties. That makes it a pattern of land fraud, not a property dispute." She met his eyes. "Individual ranchers fighting individual boundary claims lose, especially to someone with Crow's money. But a documented pattern of fraud presented to the Land Commission is a different matter entirely." "How do you know about the Land Commission?" She didn't answer immediately. He waited. "My father didn't only treat patients," she said finally. "In his later years, when he was too old to ride the circuit, he helped people with paperwork. Claims, filings, complaints. People in rural areas who couldn't navigate the legal language." She looked at her hands. "I helped him, for years. I know how these processes work." Ethan stared at her. He had hired through an agency a practical woman to help run a cattle ranch. What had arrived was something he had no category for. "Clara," he said. "Yes. Who exactly are you?" She looked at him, and for the first time since she'd stepped off that stagecoach, the composure cracked just slightly. Not the steadiness, not the capability, but something younger and more vulnerable showed through for just a moment, like a hand pulling back a curtain only an inch. "Someone who needed somewhere to be useful," she said. "And someone who read your letter and thought—" She stopped. "Thought what? That you needed more than you were asking for." A pause. "And that I had more to give than most people could see." Garrity came back with a box of papers. Ethan didn't say anything more. But he thought about it the whole ride home, the way she'd said it more than I was asking for, and the way it landed accurate and precise, the way everything she said seemed to land. Because she was right. He had asked for the least possible thing, and what came through his door anyway was something that was systematically, quietly, completely changing everything. Porsche, That night after dinner, she found him on the porch. He was sitting on the top step in the dark, which was where he sat when he needed to think and didn't want walls around him. She came out with 2 cups of coffee and handed him one and sat down 2 steps below, which meant she was below his sight line, which meant she wasn't looking at him and he wasn't looking at her, and that was exactly the right distance. "I didn't mean to blindside you," she said. "About the land commission." "You didn't blindside me. I should have told you my thinking earlier." "You probably should have," he agreed. "But you were waiting to see if you were right." She was quiet. "Am I?" she asked. "About the pattern." "Yes. I've suspected it for months. I just didn't know what to do with the suspicion." He drank his coffee. "I'm a cattle rancher. I know land and animals and weather. I don't know legal processes." "I do. I know." The dark beyond the porch was full of the sounds that Montana nights were full of: insects, a distant coyote, the horses moving in the corral. The sky above them was absurd with stars, the way it always was out here, the kind of sky that made you feel small if you were in a bad mood, and immense if you were in a good one. "Ethan," Clara said. "Why did you tell me about your son this morning?" He thought about it. "I didn't plan to," he said. "I know, but you did." He turned the coffee cup in his hands. "Because you were in that room, and I couldn't pretend you weren't. And because—" He paused, and this was the part that was hard to say. Not because it wasn't true, but because saying it made it real in a way he'd been avoiding. "Because you looked at me like you weren't going to break if I told you something difficult." "I won't," she said. "I'm starting to believe that." The coyote called again, further away this time. The horses settled. "I don't want to replace what you had," Clara said, looking out into the dark. "I want you to know that. I'm not trying to come in here and overwrite something that was real. Your wife was real. Your son was real. That matters." His throat tightened in a way he refused to let his face show. "The life you're going to have now is also real," she said. "That's all I'm saying." She stood, collected her coffee cup. "The 2 things can both be true." She went back inside. He sat on the porch for another hour until the cold came down from the mountains and drove him in. And when he lay down that night in the bed that had felt like a punishment for 3 years and 8 months, it felt like something slightly different. Not comfort. Not yet. But the possibility of it, which was further than he'd been able to see in a very long time. He closed his eyes. In the small room at the end of the hall, he heard her moving, settling, going still. He listened to another person in his house, the small, ordinary, enormous fact of another person in his house, and he thought more than I was asking for. And for the first time in 3 years and 8 months, he did not argue with what was true. The filing arrived on a Tuesday. Ethan was in the barn when Tom Briggs rode up fast with a sealed envelope from the county office, which meant someone in Silver Creek had paid for express delivery, which meant someone wanted Ethan to know quickly and not have time to think. He wiped his hands and opened it standing in the barn doorway, and he read it twice, and then he walked to the house. Clara was at the kitchen table with Garrity's records spread out in front of her, and her notebook open beside them, where it had been every morning for the past 4 days. She had been building something in that notebook: columns, timelines, names and dates cross-referenced in a system that made sense to her, and that he was beginning to understand. He set the envelope on the table in front of her without a word. She read it. Her face stayed still the whole time, which he'd learned meant she was working, not that she was calm. When she finished, she set it down and said, "He moved faster than I expected. That a problem? It means he's more confident than I thought." She picked up the document again and read the second page. "He's claiming the boundary settlement from '78 was never officially recorded. He cited his own surveyor's findings as the basis for the claim, and he's named a specific parcel, the river-adjacent section, north 40 acres. She looked up. "That's the most valuable piece of your land." "I know what it is. He's not trying to take all of it, Ethan. He's trying to take the one piece that controls water access for everything else. If he gets the north 40, He can make the rest of your ranch unworkable within 2 seasons." The room was very quiet. "He's done this before," Ethan said. "Exactly like this, the Garrity water dispute look." She turned the notebook so he could see. She had drawn a timeline that ran across 2 pages. The Garrity action, the Henderson action. 2 others she'd found references to in the documents from the county records office that Tom Briggs had retrieved for her last week after she'd written to them directly. Same parcel type every time. River access, creek access. He doesn't want the land. He wants the water. Because whoever controls water in a valley like this controls every ranch in it. Ethan pulled out a chair and sat down across from her. He looked at the timeline. The line connecting 4 properties ran straight and clean through her careful handwriting, and it was so obvious now that he felt a cold anger settle into his chest. Not the hot kind that made men ride out and do stupid things, but the cold kind, the kind that stays and sharpens. "He's been building a monopoly," Ethan said. "On water rights. Yes." Clara closed the notebook. "And he's been doing it one at a time in cases small enough that nobody connects them. A boundary dispute here. A recording question there. Each one looks like an isolated problem. Until you put them on the same page." "Until you put them on the same page," she confirmed. He looked at the filing on the table. Nathaniel Crow, acting through his attorney, Leland Marsh of the Silver Creek office of Marsh and Associates, claiming disputed boundary requesting formal survey. Adjudication requesting temporary injunction against use of the north parcel, pending determination. Temporary injunction. That was the piece that would hurt. That was the piece designed to hurt, because an injunction meant he couldn't use the North 40 while the case dragged on. And the North 40 was where the best grazing was, and losing that grazing through the summer and into fall would hit his cattle numbers hard and hard. Cattle numbers meant a hard winter, and a hard winter meant, "Don't," Clara said. He looked at her. "Don't follow that chain," she said. "I can see you doing it. Don't. We're not at the end of it yet. You don't know where that chain ends. I know it doesn't end the way you're thinking." She reached across the table and put her hand on top of the filing. Not on his hand, she didn't do that. She kept a careful and appropriate distance, but on the document itself, like she was physically covering it. "Because he doesn't know what I know, and what I know is enough." He looked at her hand on the paper. "Tell me," he said. "Not yet." She stood. "I need one more thing first. I need to talk to the Hendersons." "The Hendersons left Silver Creek." "I know. Tom Briggs told me they went to Butte." She was already moving to her jacket on the hook by the door. "I need someone to ride to Butte." "Clara, that's 4 days, I know." She turned. "Ethan, the Hendersons are the key. They went all the way through the legal process with Crow. They won and still lost. That means they have documents from inside the process filings responses the actual boundary determination that we can't get anywhere else." She looked at him steadily. "If I can show the Land Commission that Crow ran the same scheme in 4 separate cases, used the same attorney, cited the same false survey methods, and targeted the same type of parcel every single time, that's not a property dispute anymore. That's a criminal pattern." He was quiet for a moment. "Criminal," he said. "Land fraud is a federal offense in this territory. Has been since '73. She held his eyes. "I need the Henderson documents." Ethan said nothing for 10 seconds. Then he stood cross to the hook by the door and took his coat. "I'll ride to Butte," he said. "You can't leave the land. Holt Briggs will watch it. He owes me 6 years of favors." He put on his coat. "And I'm not sending you to Butte. You said that about Helena. I'll say it about every city you propose riding to alone while Nathaniel Crow has men on the roads who know your face." He looked at her hard. "You went to the county records office. You've been to Garrity's 3 times. Whoever Crow has watching this ranch, and he has someone, Clara, I'd bet my deed on it, they know who you are. She opened her mouth. She closed it. This was he had learned how Clara Bennett looked when she acknowledged someone else was right. Not surrender, recalculation. 4 days, she said. 3 if the road's dry. I'll keep building the file here. I'll talk to Lena Cahill. She knows everyone in this county, and I think there are 2 more properties Crow looked at before he moved on them. I want those names. Don't go to anyone Crow might be watching. Ethan, I grew up traveling rural Kansas with a man who had to ask strangers for help every day. I know how to talk to people without raising questions. He believed her. He also hated leaving. Holt will be here by morning, he said. Go tonight, she said. File a formal response to the injunction request before you leave. Hendrix's boy runs the telegraph send to the county seat that you're contesting the injunction. That buys us time. He looked at her for a moment. This woman who had arrived on a stagecoach 11 days ago with 1 suitcase and apparently an entire legal strategy already forming in the back of her mind. What did you tell the agency? He asked. When you applied. She raised an eyebrow. In your letter. What did you tell them about yourself? I said I was a widow capable of hard work with medical and domestic skills. A pause. I may have left out a few things. A few. Something almost like a smile. Not quite, but almost. Go to Butte, Ethan, she said. I'll be here when you get back. And the thing about that, the thing he didn't say, the thing he carried with him when he rode out an hour later into the Montana dark, was that it was the first time in 3 years and 8 months that someone had said those words to him. I'll be here when you get back. He rode with that sentence the whole way to Butte. He was gone for 4 days. Clara didn't waste a single hour of them. The morning after he left, she went to see Lena Cahill at the boarding house with a list of questions she'd written out the night before. Lena, who had lived in Silver Creek for 22 years and had the memory of a woman who understood that information was its own kind of currency, knew everything Clara asked about and more. 2 properties. Clara had guessed right. A sheep operation north of the Garrity place that had been sold quietly 3 years ago. The owner, a man named Pruitt, had simply loaded his family and left no dispute, no filing, no public record of why. And a smaller parcel east of the Henderson land, a widow named Mrs. Alcott, who had sold her water-adjacent section to a land company for a price that Lena described with careful restraint as not what it was worth. Was the land company Crow's? Clara asked. Lena folded her hands on the boarding house table. The papers said Meridian Land Associates, but Earl Poole looked into it last year just out of curiosity, and Meridian's registered agent in Helena is a man named Marsh. Leland Marsh, Crow's attorney. Clara wrote it down. Mrs. Alcott, she said. Is she still in the territory? Lives with her daughter in Silver Creek, the house on Birch Street with the blue shutters. Clara closed her notebook. Thank you, Lena. Are you going to stop him? Lena asked. I'm going to try. Lena looked at her with the expression of a woman who had watched things go wrong in small towns for a long time, and had developed strong opinions about the difference between people who tried and people who succeeded. How does Ethan feel about all this? He rode to Butte for me, Clara said. Lena's expression shifted into something warmer and more complicated. First time that man's left this county in 4 years, she said. You know that. Clara hadn't known that. She kept her face even. I'll be back by noon if you think of anything else. She was out the door before Lena could say more. Mrs. Alcott was 71 years old, small, sharp-eyed, and furious. That last part became clear within about 2 minutes of Clara sitting down in her daughter's parlor, because the story that came out of Mrs. Alcott was not the story of a woman who had sold willingly. It was the story of a woman who had been told through a series of increasingly frightening conversations with a man she'd never met in person, only through letters. Always through letters. Never anything you could point to as a threat, that her claim to the water rights on her eastern section was legally questionable, that the cost of defending it would be significant, that a reasonable woman in her position might consider accepting a fair price now rather than an uncertain outcome later. Did he threaten you directly? Clara asked. Never a word I could quote in court, Mrs. Alcott said. Her hands were in her lap, and they were very still, which Clara recognized as the stillness of someone who has spent time being angry in a controlled way. That was the cleverness of it. Every letter was polite. Every letter was reasonable. Every letter made me feel like the problem was mine. The attorney was Marsh. A man named Marsh, yes. Young, very well dressed. She paused. He came to see me in person once, just once. He sat in this very room, and he said very politely, very quietly, that he hoped this matter could be resolved without the unpleasantness of a public hearing, because public hearings had a way of raising questions that were difficult to put back to rest. Her eyes met Clara's. I was 68 years old and alone. I sold. Clara reached across and put her hand briefly over the old woman's. Will you write it down? She asked. Everything you just told me. In your own words, exactly as it happened. Will it help? It will help considerably. Mrs. Alcott straightened in her chair. Then get me paper. Ethan came back on the fourth day late afternoon, dusty and tired, in the way of a man who had ridden hard in both directions. He came into the kitchen and found Clara at the table. Her table. Their table. It had become the table with papers organized into stacks so methodical they looked like something from a law office. He stood in the doorway looking at it. You've been busy, he said. Sit down. I'll get you food. She was already at the stove. He sat. He looked at the stacks. 5 of them he counted, each with a label written in her clear hand at the top of the first page. He recognized Garrity's name. He recognized the county records. He saw a name he didn't recognize: Alcott and 2 others. Henderson, he asked. Tell me first. He took the packet from his coat pocket and set it on the table. Clara turned from the stove, saw it, and crossed to the table without the food, her attention entirely redirected. She picked up the packet and began reading, standing up, still holding the spatula. He watched her read. Her face went through 5 distinct expressions in as many minutes, and he was starting to know them well enough to read them. The first was focus. The second was recognition she'd found something she expected. The third was a sharpening, a refinement of something she'd already believed. The fourth was the still and absorbing. The fifth was something he hadn't seen before. Satisfaction, not triumph, not gloating, the deep, quiet satisfaction of someone who has worked a very long time on a very difficult problem and has just found the piece that makes it whole. She set the Henderson documents down. She looked at him. He made a mistake, she said. Tell me. In the Henderson case, when they went all the way to adjudication, the final boundary determination was made by the county. And the county surveyor who made that determination, she turned to the document and put her finger on a name, is the same surveyor that Crow brought to Silver Creek last week. Ethan stared at it. He used the same man, he said. Not just the same man. Look at the date on the Henderson survey, and the date on the filing Crow made for the Garrity claim. She pulled Garrity's papers from the stack and laid them next to the Henderson documents. Same month. He was running 2 claims simultaneously, using the same surveyor who was supposed to be an independent expert in the Henderson adjudication. A surveyor who had already received payment from Crow's company. She looked up. That's not a boundary dispute. That's conspiracy to defraud, and it's documented in the official record of the Henderson case by the county's own hand. The kitchen was very quiet. Clara, Ethan said slowly. He didn't think anyone would put it together. Because the cases were separate. Different counties, different filings, different years. He was careful. But he used the same surveyor because that man would say what Crow needed him to say. And you don't replace someone like that when he's working. She sat down. That was his mistake. Ethan looked at the documents. He looked at her. He thought about the man who had staked his north boundary in the dark of night and filed a legal claim designed to drag him down slowly, and he felt the cold anger in his chest shift into something else, something that felt for the first time like the high ground. "The food's burning," he said quietly. She jumped up. "Lord!" She salvaged the pan. He cleared a space on the table. They ate without talking for a few minutes, which was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who had just found something important and needed a moment to simply be with it. Then Ethan said, "What do we do with it?" "I write the formal complaint. I've already drafted most of it. I need to incorporate the Henderson documents and the Alcott testimony." "Who's Alcott?" She told him about Mrs. Alcott. He listened with his fork halfway to his mouth. "She said he threatened her." Not in words that could be quoted, but the pattern of the letters, "Clara." He set his fork down. "She's 71 years old, and she sold land she loved because some man in a good coat frightened her out of it." "Yes." "That's—" He stopped. The word he was looking for was not a ranch word and not a legal word, but it was the right word. "That's wrong." "Yes, it is." She held his eyes. "And I'm going to make it right." He looked at her for a long moment across the table. The table that was their table, now in the house that was starting to feel like a house again. And he thought that he had written a letter asking for the minimum and had somehow received something that had no bottom to it. "What do you need from me?" he said. "I need you to go see Crow." He went very still. "Not to fight him," she said quickly. "Not to threaten him. I need you to meet with him, in town, in public, at his office. I need you to let him think you're scared. Let him think you're looking for a way to settle. You want me to act frightened. I want you to buy me 3 days." She leaned forward. "I've written to the Territorial Land Commission in Helena. I have a contact there. A man my father helped with a claim years ago who now works in the commissioner's office. If I send him what we have, he can place an emergency inquiry flag on Crow's operation, which freezes any new filings while the commission reviews the complaint. But that takes 3 days to process. And if Crow files for the injunction in the meantime, we lose the North 40 while it's contested, which is exactly what he wants." She sat back. "I need 3 days, Ethan. Can you walk into that man's office and make him believe you're not sure what to do?" He thought about Nathaniel Crow. He'd seen him twice in Silver Creek, once outside his land office, once at the hotel where he apparently kept a permanent suite. A man who wore city clothes in a cattle town, which was its own kind of announcement. A man who carried himself with the specific confidence of someone who had never been wrong about who had power in a room. "I can do that," Ethan said. "Don't negotiate. Don't agree to anything. Just listen and let him talk, because men like him can't resist explaining their advantage to someone they think is beaten. I know the type. And Ethan." She held his eyes. "Whatever he says to you in that office, no matter how far under your skin it gets, you walk out of there without touching him." He looked at her. "Promise me," she said. The word promise sat between them, different from ordinary words. He hadn't promised anyone anything in a long time. "I promise," he said. She held his gaze for one more moment, checking it the way she checked everything thoroughly without apology. Then she nodded and reached for her notebook. He went to see Crow the next morning. Crow's land office was the largest private building on Main Street, which was itself a statement. A man in a good suit met Ethan at the door and showed him into a back office, where Crow sat behind a desk large enough to convey exactly the message it was designed to convey. Nathaniel Crow was perhaps 50. Silver-haired, broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that had probably been handsome and had settled into something harder. He rose to shake Ethan's hand with the warm, firm grip of a man performing confidence. "Mr. Walker," he said, "I'm glad you came in. Figured we should talk. I think that's wise." He gestured to the chair across his desk. "Sit down, please." Ethan sat. He arranged his face into the expression of a man working very hard not to show he was worried, which was easier than it might have been, because most of it was true. He was worried. He was just worried about different things than Crow assumed. "I want you to know," Crow began, settling back in his chair, "that I take no personal pleasure in these situations. This is simply business." "What kind of business involves staking another man's land in the middle of the night?" Crow smiled. It was a smooth smile, the kind that had been practiced. The stakes were a surveying marker, a technical matter. The technical matter was 15 yards inside my line. That's precisely the question, Mr. Walker, where your line actually falls. He folded his hands. I've had the area professionally surveyed. There are questions about the original boundary determination that I believe deserve a proper review. The county settled that question in '78. The county made a determination, yes. Whether it was properly recorded and whether the methodology was sound, he spread his hands. Those are the questions my filing raises. He was good. Clara had said he would be good, and she was right. Every word was technically defensible. Every phrase was designed to sound reasonable. The trap was in agreeing with any of it. What are you looking for? Ethan said. Just plainly. Plainly. Crow seemed to appreciate the directness. The north section of your property along the river has characteristics that would be valuable to a development project I'm working on. Water access. I'm prepared to offer fair market value. For land I already own. For land that is at present in legitimate legal dispute. He leaned slightly forward. Mr. Walker, I've done this before. These matters can take a year to resolve. Sometimes 2. In the meantime, your cattle can't graze that section. Your water access becomes complicated. The legal costs. I know what the legal costs are, Ethan said quietly. Crow nodded, sympathetic. Then you understand why a clean resolution benefits everyone. You'd drop the claim. In exchange for a fair sale price? Yes. Ethan looked at the desk between them. He thought about Clara at the kitchen table with 5 stacks of documents and the name of a territorial contact in Helena, and 3 days she needed him to buy. He made his face do the thing she'd asked it to do. I'd need to think, he said. Talk to a pause exactly the right length. My situation's changed recently. Something crossed Crow's face. Interest sharpening. Your mail-order bride, he said. The words were delivered perfectly casually, which meant they were not casual. Ethan kept his face even. She's got an opinion about the land. I imagine she does. Crow's voice shifted almost imperceptibly. Not quite dismissive. Something adjacent to it. Understandable. She's new here. She doesn't know the territory. A pause. She doesn't know how things work. Ethan looked at him. He thought about Clara reading that legal filing at the kitchen table. Clara in the south pasture at 4 a.m. Clara across from Mrs. Alcott with her notebook and her steady, careful questions. Clara saying whatever he says you walk out of there without touching him. He breathed. Give me a week, he said. Crow smiled. Of course. He rose, extending his hand again. I think you're a reasonable man, Mr. Walker. Reasonable men find solutions. Ethan shook the hand. He walked out of the office and down the steps to Main Street and stood for a moment in the morning air, and the cold anger in his chest had changed again, sharpened into something clean and precise and patient. She doesn't know how things work. He got on his horse. He thought you have no idea what's coming. He told Clara everything that night, word for word, the way she'd asked him to. She sat at the table and listened, and wrote 2 things in her notebook, and asked one clarifying question about the moment Crow mentioned the Water Access Development Project, because that was the first time Crow had said anything about a specific project, and a specific project meant specific investors, and specific investors meant financial records. He slipped, she said. He thinks I'm beaten, Ethan said. He got comfortable. Good. She capped her pen. I sent the formal complaint to Helena this morning, and I sent copies to the county seat and to the federal land office in Billings. She looked up. I also sent a letter to the territorial newspaper. He went still. The newspaper. Not the story. Not yet. Just a letter to the correspondent they have for land issues flagging that there may be a significant story developing regarding water rights in this county, and that I'd be willing to speak to him at the appropriate time. She held his gaze. Crow has lawyers and money. We need pressure from a direction he can't buy his way out of. Ethan stared at her. Clara, he said, that is either brilliant, or it's going to make him come at us harder. Both, she said calmly. But if he comes at us harder, he makes mistakes faster. And we're more ready for his mistakes than he knows. Silence. He called you a mail-order bride, Ethan said. I know. She didn't react. What did he say exactly? That you were new here, that you didn't know how things work. His voice was level, but something in it was not entirely level. He dismissed you, like you were, like I was exactly what he thought I was. She nodded slowly. Good. That's exactly what I wanted him to think. He looked at her. Ethan. She set down her notebook. Every man who has ever underestimated me has regretted it eventually. Nathaniel Crowe will not be the exception. A pause. The question isn't whether we win. I believe we win. The question is whether we can protect this land and these families and make sure he can't do it again to the next person. She held his eyes. That's what I'm building toward. Not just your ranch, all of it. The lamp was low between them. He had come home from Silver Creek 2 hours ago with Crowe's smooth voice still in his head and the cold anger still in his chest, and he had sat down at this table across from this woman, and she had taken what he'd brought her and turned it into a next step. Every time. Every single time. What do you need tomorrow? He said. She picked up her pen. I need you to ride to the Garrities and tell them to stay close to home this week. Don't tell them why, yet I don't want anything getting back to Crowe before the inquiry lands in Helena. She wrote something. And I need you to check the north pasture boundary every morning. If he sends surveyors again, I need to know within the hour. And tonight? She looked up. He gestured at the stacks of paper, the open notebook, the evidence of everything she'd built in 4 days while he'd been on the road to Butte. Tonight, she said, I finish the complaint. A pause. And you sleep because you've been writing for 4 days and you look like it. He almost said something. He decided against it. He stood and looked at her bent over her work at the table. His table, their table. The table that was a table again, and he stood there for 1 moment too long, which she noticed without looking up. Good night, Ethan, she said. Good night, Clara. He went to bed, and in the kitchen, long after the rest of Silver Creek went dark, a lamp burned steady at a kitchen table, where a woman who was not what anyone had expected sat working on a case that was going to change this valley. Writing in her careful, clear hand, the words that were going to undo a man who had called her without a second thought. Just a mail-order bride. She wrote until midnight. Then she capped her pen, stacked her papers, and went to the window. Outside, the north pasture was dark and quiet and whole. She looked at it the way she had looked at Silver Creek from the stagecoach step that first morning, reading it, taking inventory, deciding. And what she decided standing at the window of a ranch house in Montana at midnight was the thing she had known in some quiet and certain part of herself since she had first read a letter from a man who couldn't even ask for what he truly needed. This was where she was going to stay. The letter from Helena arrived on a Thursday morning, and it arrived with company. Ethan was checking the north boundary the way he'd done every morning for the past 6 days, methodical and early, before Crowe's men had reason to be moving, when he saw the rider coming up the main road fast. Not one of Crowe's men. A territorial courier, the kind with the brass badge on his coat that meant official business. Ethan turned his horse and rode to intercept him at the gate. The courier handed over 2 envelopes, both addressed to the Walker Ranch. One bore the seal of the Montana Territorial Land Commission. The other had no seal at all, just his name in handwriting he didn't recognize, cramped and hurried like someone who had written fast. He took both to the house. Clara was at the table. She saw his face when he came through the door, and was on her feet before he reached her. He handed her the Land Commission envelope first. She opened it. Read it. He watched her face go through 3 expressions in 10 seconds. Focus. Then something that was almost relief. Then that deep, quiet satisfaction he'd seen the night she'd found the surveyor's name in the Henderson documents. The inquiry flag went through, she said. They've placed a temporary hold on all new filings by Meridian Land Associates and associated parties pending review of the complaint. She looked up. He can't file the injunction. How long does the hold last? 30 days minimum, long enough for the commission to review what I sent them. She set the letter down carefully the way you set something fragile down. He's frozen Ethan. Every move he planned to make in this county is frozen until the commission decides. He let that land. 30 days. It wasn't a victory, not yet, but it was the first solid ground they'd had since that orange-ribboned stake appeared on his north boundary, and he felt something in his chest loosen that he hadn't realized had been clenched. The other one? Clara said, nodding at the envelope still in his hand. He'd almost forgotten it. He opened it and read it, and the loosening in his chest reversed itself. It's from one of Crow's men, he said. Clara went still. Not a legal document. A note. He read it again to make sure he had it right. It says that Mr. Crow is aware of the complaint filed with the commission. It says that Mr. Crow considers this an escalation. And it says, he stopped. Say it, Clara said. It says that Mr. Crow hopes Miss Bennett understands that the territory can be an unfriendly place for people who insert themselves into matters that don't concern them. The kitchen was absolutely silent. Clara did not move for a full 5 seconds. Then she said very quietly, "He knows my name." "Yes." "He knows I filed the complaint." "He knows enough." Ethan set the note on the table. His voice was steady. His hands were not entirely steady, which he controlled by placing them flat on the table. "Someone in Helena talked, or someone at the county seat, or someone in Silver Creek who saw you at the records office." She picked up the note and read it herself. He watched her. He was watching for fear because fear was the reasonable response, and he would not have blamed her for it. What he saw instead was something colder than fear, and more useful, a focused, contained anger, the same kind he'd felt the morning he'd found those survey stakes on his land. "He's rattled," she said. "Clara, a man who isn't rattled doesn't send unsigned notes. He files paperwork. He sends lawyers." She put the note down. "This is a man who woke up this morning and found out his timeline has been disrupted, and his method has been exposed, and he can't do the thing he planned to do, and so he's reacting." She looked at Ethan. "Reacting people make mistakes. Reacting people also do things that can't be filed in a courtroom," he said. "Clara, this is a threat." "I know what it is." "Then you know I'm not going to—" "You're not going to do anything rash," she said, and the precision of it, the way she read exactly where his mind was going, pulled him up short. "I was going to say I'm not going to ignore it." "Good, don't ignore it." She sat down. "Write it into the record. Date, time, received, method of delivery. We add it to the complaint as evidence of intimidation, because threatening a witness in an active territorial commission inquiry is its own separate offense." She picked up her pen. "What he just did made our case stronger." Ethan stared at her. "You're not afraid," he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was closer to wonder. She looked up from her notebook. "I'm afraid," she said. "I'm just not going to let him see it." A pause. "There's a difference." He pulled out a chair and sat down across from her. "You need to move into town," he said. She put her pen down. "Listen to me," he said before she could argue. "The land is what I need protected. I can be here for that. But you are the one who built this case. You are the one who can present it. If something happens to you, nothing is going to happen to me. You don't know that, Ethan." She held his gaze level and direct. "If I run to town every time that man makes a threatening noise, I am telling him that the tactic works. And if the tactic works on me, he will use it on every person in this valley who tries to stand up to him for the next 10 years. She leaned forward slightly. "I am not going to teach Nathaniel Crow that frightening people works." The room was quiet. He looked at her across the table. This woman, this impossible, infuriating, extraordinary woman who had arrived in his life 17 days ago and had systematically dismantled every assumption he'd had about what he needed and what she was and what the two of them were becoming. And he felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Not just respect, not just admiration. Something that lived deeper than both of those. Something that had no clean name, but that he recognized the way you recognize a road you traveled once a long time ago in different weather. "All right," he said. "All right. You stay. But Holt's boy stays on the property with us, armed, starting tonight." She considered it. "Agreed," she said. "And you don't go anywhere alone. Not to town, not to Garrity's, not to the mailbox." She opened her mouth. "Clara." She closed it. "Agreed," she said with the tone of someone who was agreeing for now and reserving the right to revisit later. He knew that tone by now. He decided to take the agreement and leave the rest alone. Tom Briggs arrived that evening with his rifle and his bedroll and a complete and total refusal to say anything about the situation beyond "yep" and "sure" and "tell me where you want me." Which was exactly why Ethan had asked for Tom, and not anyone who might have opinions. Holt came with him uninvited, which was also expected. Holt sat at the kitchen table with his coffee and looked at the stacks of documents and said, "Is all this what I think it is?" "What do you think it is?" Clara said. "I think it's a case that's going to end Nathaniel Crow in this territory." He looked at her steadily. "Am I wrong?" "I hope not," she said. He nodded once. "What can I do?" "The Garrity's need someone to check on them without making it obvious they're being checked on. And there's a widow named Alcott on Birch Street in town who lives alone. I'd feel better if someone was paying attention to her comings and goings." Holt wrote nothing down. He was the kind of man who didn't need to. "Done," he said. Ethan watched Holt look at Clara and watched Clara look back at Holt and felt the specific particular quality of being in the presence of two people who had just taken each other's measure and found the result satisfactory. After Holt and Tom had settled in after Clara had gone to her room and the house had gone quiet, Holt found Ethan on the porch. "You know," Holt said without preamble or building toward it, because Holt never built toward anything Sarah would have liked her. Ethan was quiet. "Not because they're the same. They're not." Holt leaned on the porch rail. "But because Sarah always said what you needed was someone who matched you, not someone who managed you." He paused. "She told me that once, 3 months before the accident. She said if anything ever happened to her, she hoped you found someone who could match you." Ethan's throat tightened in the way it did when something true arrived faster than his defenses could arrange themselves. "She said that—" "Sitting right here on this porch," Holt said. "Summer of '78. You were in the barn." He looked out at the dark. "I never told you because there was never a right time. And then there was never a right time for a long time." A pause. "But tonight seems like it might be close to right." Ethan said nothing for a long moment. "I don't know what she thinks," he said. "Clara, about I don't know what she thinks." "Have you asked her?" "We've had other things happening." Holt made a sound. "Ethan, you have been using this land dispute as an excuse not to deal with the thing that's actually happening in this house." "That's not—" "It is entirely." Holt picked up his coffee cup from the rail. "I'll be in the barn with Tom if anything happens tonight." He went down the porch steps and stopped. "She filed a territorial complaint and took a threat from a dangerous man and didn't flinch. I'd say she's given you a pretty clear indication of who she is." He walked to the barn. "The rest is up to you." Ethan sat on the porch alone for a long time after that. Nothing happened that night, or the next. On the third day, the territorial newspaper correspondent arrived in Silver Creek. His name was James Whitfield, and he wrote for the Helena Courier, and he was younger than Ethan expected, 26-27, with the quick recording eyes of someone who processed everything as potential print. He came to the ranch at Clara's invitation, and Clara sat across from him at the kitchen table and talked for 2 hours while Ethan stayed out of the way and tried not to listen, and listened to all of it. She was careful, precise. She gave him the pattern, the documented connections, the surveyor's name, the Meridian Land Associates registration. She gave him Mrs. Alcott's written testimony. She gave him the dates and the sequence and the 4 properties. And she explained the water rights strategy in language clear enough for a reader who knew nothing about territorial land law. She did not give him anything she wasn't ready to defend in a formal proceeding. Ethan had underestimated how good she was at this. He'd watched her with Garrity, with Lena Cahill, with Mrs. Alcott. He'd read her written complaint, which was thorough and careful, and formally structured in a way that suggested serious familiarity with how these documents worked. But watching her talk to a reporter, knowing exactly what to give him, exactly what to hold back, guiding the conversation with an invisible hand so that he left with what she wanted him to have, and nothing he shouldn't was something else. When Whitfield left, she sat back in her chair and let out a long breath. "Well," she said. "Well?" Ethan said from the doorway. She looked at him. "How much did you hear?" "Enough." "And?" He came in and sat down across from her. "Where did you learn to do that?" "Do what?" "Talk to a man for 2 hours and have him leave thinking he got everything when you gave him exactly what you decided to give him." Something crossed her face. Not quite amusement, not quite pride. Something in between that she was keeping careful control of. "My father negotiated with hospitals' county commissioners and angry patients' families for 30 years. I watched." A pause. "And I've had to negotiate for myself since I was 22. You learn." "You've been negotiating alone since you were 22. "Yes. For 14 years. "I can count, Ethan." He looked at her. "That's a long time to be doing everything by yourself," he said. The thing he was actually saying was underneath that, and they both knew it, and she heard it because he watched her hear it, watched something in her face go very still in a different way than the working still, or the absorbing still. A personal still. A careful still. "It is," she said. Silence. "Clara." A horse came in fast outside. They both heard it, and both moved the way they'd learned to move together in 3 weeks quickly and without needing to negotiate who went where. Ethan was at the door, and Clara was 2 steps behind him when Tom Briggs appeared on the porch, and Tom's face told them before his mouth did that something had happened. "Crow's men hit the Garrity place," Tom said. "This morning. Cut the fence on the east pasture and let 40 head of cattle onto the road." Clara said, "Were the Garritys hurt?" "No. But 40 head are scattered from here to the Blackfoot, and Garrity's 2 boys are out trying to round them up, and old Garrity's half out of his mind." "Did anyone see Crow's men?" Clara said. "Garrity saw 2 men on horseback riding away from the fence line. Didn't recognize them. Could have been anyone." "Could have been anyone," Ethan said, and his voice was flat in the way that meant something was moving underneath it, that he was choosing to keep below the surface. He turned and looked at Clara. She was already thinking. He could see at the timeline running in her head the move and the counter-move. "This is his answer to the hold," she said. "Explain. He can't file paperwork. He can't move through legal channels while the commission inquiry is active. So he's shifting tactics." She looked at Tom. "This isn't about Garrity. This is a message. He's telling us that if we keep pressing, people get hurt. Not us, not yet. People connected to us." Ethan looked at Tom. "Go back to the Garritys and help with the cattle. Tell Garrity not to say a word to anyone in town about what he saw until he hears from me." Tom nodded and was gone. Ethan turned back to Clara. "We go to Garrity's." "Yes," she said. "But Ethan—" She stopped him with a hand on his arm the first time she'd touched him with intention, with purpose, not the accidental proximity of working alongside someone. Her hand on his arm and her eyes on his face. "We go as witnesses. We document what happened. We take it to the commission as evidence of intimidation and interference during an active inquiry." Her grip tightened slightly. "That is the move, not confrontation." He looked at her hand on his arm. He looked at her face. I know, he said. I know it is. She let go. They rode to Garrity's. The scene at the Garrity ranch took 4 hours to sort out cattle found and returned fence repaired. Garrity's oldest boy nursing a cut on his hand from the wire that Clara cleaned and dressed efficiently with the kit she'd brought in her saddlebag, because of course she'd brought it. Old man Garrity sat on a fence post and watched Clara work on his boy's hand and said, "How long have you been here?" 3 weeks, Clara said. He shook his head slowly. Should have been longer. Clara didn't answer that, but Ethan standing nearby watched her not answer it and saw what not answering it meant, the way you can see what something means when a person lets it land instead of deflecting it. She stayed. She was choosing to stay. He'd known it since she'd looked out the window at the north pasture. He'd told himself he was reading too much into it, because reading too much into things was what a man did when he was starting to want something and was scared of wanting it wrong. But watching her wrap Garrity's boy's hand and document the cut fence in her notebook with the same focused attention she gave everything he knew he wasn't reading too much. He just didn't know yet what to do with knowing. The editorial ran in the Helena Courier 6 days later. Whitfield had moved fast. The piece ran on the front page of the territorial section under the headline, "Pattern of Land Fraud Alleged Across 4 Montana Counties. Territorial Commission Inquiry Underway." It named Meridian Land Associates. It named the surveyor. It described the water rights strategy in language accessible enough for any rancher in the territory to understand. It quoted without attribution a source with direct knowledge of the complaint. It did not name Clara. She had asked Whitfield not to. Ethan had watched her ask it and watched Whitfield push back and watched her hold firm without raising her voice, and Whitfield had ultimately agreed, and the piece ran without her name. The day it ran, 3 things happened. First, Leland Marsh Crow's attorney arrived at the Walker Ranch in a hired buggy and asked to speak with the property owner. Ethan met him at the gate. Marsh was exactly what Clara had described. Young, well-dressed, the kind of smooth that comes from expensive education, and the assumption that most people he dealt with were easier to confuse than he was. He had a document in his hand. "Mr. Walker," he said, "my client is prepared to withdraw the boundary claim in its entirety." Ethan looked at him. "In exchange for," Ethan said, "in exchange for a withdrawal of the complaint currently filed with the Territorial Land Commission." Ethan said nothing. "Mr. Walker, the editorial this morning has created a—" Marsh paused, choosing words carefully. "Complicated situation. My client believes a mutual withdrawal benefits everyone. The commission inquiry ends. The boundary claim ends. Everyone returns to where they were." Ethan took the document from him and looked at it. He thought about Clara's timeline. The Garrity's fence. Mrs. Alcott selling land she loved because a man in a good coat frightened her in her own parlor. The Hendersons who won and still lost everything. He handed the document back. "No," he said. Marsh blinked. "Mr. Walker." "No," he said again, quieter, more absolute. "Tell Mr. Crow we'll see him at the commission hearing." Marsh left. Second thing, 2 hours later, a telegraph arrived from the Land Commission office in Helena. The inquiry had been escalated to a full formal hearing scheduled in 3 weeks in the county seat. All parties were summoned. The temporary hold on Crow's filings was extended through the hearing date. Clara read the telegraph and sat down in the nearest chair, which was not something Clara did. She didn't simply sit down. She purposefully sat down, and Ethan realized she was letting herself feel it for a moment. This woman who controlled everything she showed, just letting herself feel it. He sat down beside her, not across the table, beside her. She looked at the telegraph. 3 weeks, she said. "Is that enough time? I'll make it enough time." She looked at him. "You turned Marsh away." "Yes. He offered you an out." "I know." Crow was offering to end it. The claim, the risk, all of it. You could have taken it." Ethan looked at her steadily. "And the Garrities and Mrs. Alcott, and the next rancher he moves against after he's learned that threatening people's livestock works." He shook his head. "No, you said it was criminal. Let's make it criminal." Something in her face changed. Not the working look. Not the absorbing look. Something entirely different. Something that opened briefly like that curtain pulled back an inch, but further this time, further than it had ever been, and what was behind it was not composure or capability or any of the extraordinary things he'd come to rely on. It was just her. Unguarded. For one moment. She looked at him and said, "Thank you, Ethan." And those 3 words, simply said, carried something in them that broke through the last of whatever had been holding him at a careful, managed distance. He said, "Clara." She said, "Yes." He said, "When this is over." She was very still. "When this is over," he said again, "I need to say something to you. And I can't say it now because right now we have 3 weeks of work and a hearing to prepare for. And I need you focused on that, and I need to be focused on that." He looked at her directly, the way she had looked at him since the moment she stepped off that stagecoach. "But when it's over." She looked at him for a long moment. "All right," she said, quietly, simply. Third thing. Nathaniel Crow left Silver Creek that evening. Earl Poole reported it. He watched Crow's man load luggage into a hired wagon outside the hotel, and watched the wagon head south toward Billings, and he came directly to the Walker Ranch to say so, because Earl Poole's instincts about what was worth saying had apparently improved considerably since this whole thing started. "He ran," Ethan said. "He's still got lawyers," Clara said immediately. "He'll come back for the hearing. He has to. Absence at a commission hearing looks like admission." She thought for a moment. "But leaving town now means he's lost his nerve. The editorial, the escalation, the inquiry going full formal." She looked at Earl. "Did he take everything?" 3 wagons worth, Earl said. "Left the office locked but the sign on the door. He's pulling back to reassess. He'll come back with a different strategy." She was already moving toward the table. "Which means I need to anticipate what that strategy is." Earl looked at Ethan. Ethan looked back. Earl said quietly so Clara wouldn't hear, "You know she's the best thing that's happened to this valley in about 10 years. Ethan said equally quietly, "I know." Earl nodded and left. The 3 weeks before the hearing were the hardest and the most alive that Ethan could remember in longer than he could honestly calculate. Hard, because Clara drove them both mercilessly. She was at the table before him every morning and still at it when he went to bed, and she rebuilt the entire complaint into a formal presentation, organized, cited, cross-referenced, that she made Ethan read twice and then read aloud to her so she could hear how it landed. "You're practicing on me," he said one evening partway through the second read aloud. "Yes," she said, "for the hearing. I need to know where the weak points are, where a good attorney could interrupt and create confusion." She made a note. "You're a smart man who doesn't know the legal language. If you can follow it, a commissioner can follow it." He kept reading, alive because of what happened in the spaces between the work, the small, unremarkable, enormous moments that he hadn't known he'd been starving for. Her laugh, which he heard for the first time on a Tuesday when Tom Briggs' horse sat down in the corral for no reason any of them could identify, and then looked extremely dignified about it. It wasn't a polished laugh. It was sudden and real, and it surprised her the same way it surprised him. Her habit of reading at the kitchen table after dinner, a book held in one hand, and her left thumb running along the bottom edge of the page, the way people do when they're deeply inside something. He had started staying at the table longer after dinner for no reason he was prepared to examine. The way she said his name. She said it the way she said everything, directly without ornamentation. But there was a quality in it now that had developed over 3 weeks. A familiarity, an easiness. Like a door that had been used enough times to stop sticking. And the night, 2 weeks into the 3, when he came in late from checking the north boundary in bad weather, and she was still up, and she looked at him dripping and cold and said nothing at all, just got up and put the kettle on and got the dry shirt he kept on the hook by the back door and handed it to him. He took it. Their hands were in contact for a second over the shirt, his cold, hers warm. Neither of them moved for a moment. Then he said, "Thank you," and she said, "The tea will be ready in 5 minutes." And that was all. And it was the most intimate moment he had experienced in 3 years and 8 months, and it nearly undid him. The hearing was scheduled for a Monday. On the Sunday before, Ethan found Clara on the porch in the early dark after dinner, looking out at the land the way she'd looked out the window that midnight 3 weeks ago. He came out and stood beside her. "Are you ready?" he asked. "Yes," she said. No hesitation. "Are you scared?" A pause this time. "Yes," she said. Of Crow's lawyer. Of it not being enough. She kept her eyes on the dark. "I have built the best case I know how to build. But there are things that could go wrong. A commissioner who has a relationship with someone in Crow's circle. A document that gets questioned on a technicality. Mrs. Alcott having a bad day." She exhaled. "There are things I can't control." "No," he agreed. "I don't like things I can't control." "I know." She turned and looked at him, and in the low light from the kitchen window she looked different from any way he'd seen her. Not the composed, purposeful woman who ran his kitchen and built his legal case and moved through difficulty the way water moves through rock. But something under all of that, something quieter and more uncertain and more real. "What if it's not enough?" she said. And he looked at her, this woman, who had done everything and been everything and held this whole thing together with her intelligence and her stubbornness and her 14 years of doing everything alone, and he said, "Then we do it again. We build it again. We find another way." He held her gaze. "You are not in this by yourself anymore." She looked at him. "Ethan," she said. "I know," he said. "I said when it's over." "It's not over yet." "No." He looked at her for a moment longer than was practical or manageable. "But I wanted you to know. Before tomorrow. Whatever happens tomorrow." He stopped. Started again. "You came here and you changed everything. The land, the cattle, that table in there." He paused. "Me. And I don't know how to say that without it sounding like less than it is. But I needed you to know it before we walk into that room tomorrow." The dark was very quiet around them. Clara looked at him for a long time. "I came here," she said finally, "because a man wrote a letter asking for the minimum possible thing he could ask for, and I thought that man is going to ache himself to death out there if someone doesn't show up and refuse to let him." A pause. "I didn't plan the rest of it. I didn't plan any of this." "Neither did I." "No." Something in her face was very open. "But I'm not sorry about it." "Neither am I," he said. They stood on the porch together in the Montana dark, not touching, not crossing the distance that the hearing and the case and the mourning had put on pause, but standing in it together, which was itself a kind of answer to a question neither of them had said out loud yet. Tomorrow was the hearing. Tomorrow was Nathaniel Crow and Leland Marsh and the Territorial Land Commission, and 4 years of fraud laid out on a table for men with authority to examine. But tonight was this, the two of them. The dark, the north pasture, whole and quiet, and theirs. And the thing between them that had no name yet, but that both of them knew with complete certainty was real. Ethan went in first. Clara stayed a moment longer, looking at the land. Then she followed him inside, and the door closed, and the lamp burned in the kitchen window, steady and warm against the dark. They rode to the county seat before sunrise. Clara had the document case on her lap, a leather case that Holt Briggs's wife had lent her, old and well-made, the kind that closes with 2 brass clasps, and she held it the way you hold something that contains everything you've worked toward, not clutching it, just aware of it. Ethan drove the wagon and didn't talk, which was the right thing, because she was running through the case in her head, the way she'd done every night for 3 weeks, and she didn't need conversation. She needed the quiet, Tom Briggs rode behind them. Holt rode ahead. The Garrities were already at the county seat when they arrived, Old Man Garrity and his two sons in their good coats that were clearly only worn twice a year, standing outside the commission building with the specific dignity of people who have dressed up for something important and intend to see it through. Mrs. Alcott was there too, sitting on the bench near the door with her daughter beside her, her hands folded in her lap, her back straight. Clara got down from the wagon and went directly to Mrs. Alcott. "How are you feeling?" she said. "Angry," Mrs. Alcott said. "Same as yesterday." "Good," Clara said. "Hold on to that." She went inside. Dull. The hearing room was a plain room with a long table at the front where 3 commissioners sat and rows of chairs behind the railing where the parties and witnesses would sit. And it was already half full when they arrived, which told Ethan that the editorial had done what Clara intended it to do. It had made this a public matter, and public matters drew people who needed to know how they ended. He saw faces he recognized. Ranchers from across the county. Earl Poole in the back row, which surprised him until he remembered that Earl Poole went wherever things worth knowing about were happening. Whitfield, the correspondent in the far corner with his notebook already open. 2 men he didn't recognize in good coats at the front of the room, who he assumed were connected to Crow. Crow himself was already seated at the respondent's table. He looked the same as he had in his office, composed, silver-haired, wearing city clothes that announced money without saying it plainly. Leland Marsh sat beside him, a stack of documents in front of him, whispering something in his client's ear. Crow listened without expression. Then he saw Clara. Something moved across his face. Fast, gone before it fully formed. But Ethan saw it from across the room, and he understood it because he'd felt a version of it himself on the Silver Creek Station platform 5 weeks ago. It was the expression of a man recalibrating. Crow had known about Clara. He'd sent her a threatening note with her name on it. But knowing a name and seeing the person walk into a room with a leather document case and a straight back, and the complete undivided attention of every person in that room, those were different things. Ethan sat down beside her at the complainant's table. "He's rattled again," he said quietly. "I know," she said, opening the document case. "Don't watch him. Watch the commissioners." He watched the commissioners. There were 3 of them. An older man in the center named Horace Denby, who was the chief land commissioner for the territory, and who had the face of a man who had heard a great many stories and developed a reliable sense for which ones were true, and 2 others flanking him, whose names were on the official notice Clara had received. Denby shuffled his papers and spoke to the man on his left and did not look at either table yet, which Clara had told him was normal. Commissioners didn't signal anything at the open. You couldn't read them from the start. "Clara," he said. "Whatever happens in this room, Ethan." She looked at him sideways just briefly, and something in that look was both a thank you and a not now. "Let me work." He stopped talking. She opened her case and arranged her documents and was ready before the commissioners called the hearing to order. Leland Marsh went first, which was Crow's right as the respondent to the commission's inquiry. He was good. Clara had told Ethan he would be good, and she was right. He reframed everything. The boundary claim became a legitimate surveying question raised in good faith. The Meridian Land Associates connection became a standard business relationship between a land development company and an independent legal advisor. The surveyor, whose name appeared across 3 separate cases, became a respected professional whose work had been mischaracterized by a complaint filed by a woman with no legal standing and a personal interest in the outcome. That was the phrase he used. A woman with no legal standing and a personal interest in the outcome. Ethan felt his jaw tighten. Clara wrote something in her notebook and did not look up. Marsh presented his survey findings. He presented a letter from the Territorial Land Office in Billings, not the one Clara had sent her complaint to a different contact, which meant Crow had someone in Billings, stating that the boundary question was legitimately contested. He presented affidavits from 2 Silver Creek residents attesting to Ethan Walker's aggressive response to the survey stakes, pulled them from the ground in violation of an active survey process, Marsh said, which was a way of describing what Ethan had done that made something completely reasonable sound like an offense. He spoke for 40 minutes. When he sat down, Commissioner Denby looked at Clara's side of the table. "The complainant," he said. "Who will be presenting?" Clara stood. "I will," she said. Clara Bennett, acting on behalf of Ethan Walker, property owner of record, and in coordination with supporting witnesses. She paused. "If the commission would prefer a licensed attorney." "The commission will hear from you," Denby said, and his voice was entirely neutral, which meant nothing, but his eyes had a quality that Ethan noticed, a settled-in quality, like a man who had just decided to pay attention. Clara opened her case. "Commissioner Denby, Commissioners, I'd like to begin not with Mr. Walker's property, but with a date, October 14th, 1879. She waited one beat. That is the date on which Mr. Marsh's client, operating through Meridian Land Associates, first engaged the services of a surveyor named Gerald Pruitt to conduct a boundary assessment in Lewis and Clark County." She held up a document. "I have the contract signed by Leland Marsh on behalf of Meridian Land Associates, with Mr. Pruitt's name and terms clearly stated." Marsh's pen stopped moving. "The reason that date is significant," Clara continued, "is that on October 19th of the same year, 5 days later, Gerald Pruitt submitted sworn testimony in the Henderson boundary adjudication in this same county, describing himself as an independent expert with no ongoing client relationships that could affect his professional judgment." She held up a second document. "I have that testimony." The room was very quiet. "The same man," she said, "engaged by Crow's company on the 14th, swearing independence on the 19th. She set both documents on the commissioner's table. "That is not a surveying error. That is perjury in a sworn proceeding." Marsh was on his feet. "Commissioner, the complainant is characterizing—" "Sit down, Mr. Marsh," Denby said, not loudly, with the flat, final quality of a man who does not repeat himself. Marsh sat. Clara kept going. "She went through it all. Every property, every date, every document. She presented the timeline with the precision of someone who had rebuilt it 15 times in the past 3 weeks until it was unassailable, and she moved through it at a pace that was fast enough to hold attention and slow enough that the commissioners could follow each connection as she made it. She presented Garrity's records. She presented the 2 additional properties Pruitt's sheep operation, which she had documented through county sale records, and the Alcott parcel, which she had documented through the Meridian Land Registry in Helena. She called Mrs. Alcott. The old woman walked to the witness chair with her back straight and her hands still, and her anger intact, and she told her story in exactly the way she'd told it to Clara in her daughter's parlor, plain, specific, devastating. The letters, the implication, the visit from Marsh, the phrase about public hearings, raising questions that were difficult to put back to rest. When she finished, Commissioner Denby said, "Mrs. Alcott, did you feel threatened?" "I felt," she said with great precision, "that I was being told what would happen to me if I didn't cooperate, without anyone saying it in words I could use." She looked at Denby directly. "I was 68 years old, and I was alone, and I sold land my husband and I built together for 30 years because I was frightened. Yes, I felt threatened." The room was completely silent. Ethan looked at Crow. Crow was looking at the table in front of him with the expression of a man recalculating his options and not finding many. Clara saved the surveyor for last. She had subpoenaed Gerald Pruitt. Clara had explained to Ethan what that meant. A formal commission summons he couldn't ignore without being held in contempt. And Pruitt was sitting in the witness chairs along the wall, and he had the look of a man who had understood somewhere in the last 3 weeks that the ground beneath him had changed fundamentally. She called him. He took the witness chair. She asked him 3 questions. First, had he been engaged by Meridian Land Associates in October of 1879? He said yes. There was no point in saying no. She had the contract. Second, had he submitted testimony in the Henderson adjudication that same month, describing himself as an independent expert? A longer pause. Yes. Third, had he received payment from Meridian Land Associates at any point during the Henderson adjudication? The longest pause. Marsh stood. "Commissioner, I object to this line." "On what grounds?" Denby said. Marsh opened his mouth. He closed it. There was no ground. Clara had not asked anything that required a legal objection. She had asked a factual question of a witness under commission summons, and there was no procedural basis to stop it, and Marsh knew it, and Denby knew Marsh knew it. "Sit down, Mr. Marsh," Denby said again. He looked at Pruitt. "Answer the question," he said. Pruitt looked at Crow. Crow looked at the table. Pruitt looked back at Denby. "Yes?" he said. The word landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Clara said, "No further questions," and sat down. Ethan had spent 15 years learning to read weather. The particular quality of a sky before it broke. The pressure in the air before a temperature drop. The stillness that preceded something significant. He understood that some things, once they reached a certain point, resolved themselves according to their own logic, regardless of what anyone tried to do about them. The hearing was like that. After Pruitt's testimony, Marsh tried to reframe. He made a technical argument about the Commission's jurisdiction and the admissibility of certain documents, and the distinction between his client's personal conduct and the conduct of associated parties. He spoke for 20 minutes, and he was still good. He was a good attorney. That had never been the question, but he was good. The way a man is good at his work when the work is lost, competent and thorough and too late. Denby called a recess. 40 minutes. Ethan and Clara sat outside the building on the bench where Mrs. Alcott had been waiting that morning. Tom and Holt were nearby. Old man Garrity brought them coffee from somewhere and didn't say anything, just handed them the cups and went back to his sons. Clara held the coffee in both hands. "How do you think it went?" Ethan asked. "I don't know yet." "Yes, you do." She looked at him sideways, a long moment. "I think we gave them everything they need," she said. "Whether they use it?" She stopped. "I've seen good cases lose on things that had nothing to do with the evidence. But Denby is a fair man. I looked into him before we came. He ruled against 2 territorial officials in 1880 for survey irregularities. He's not afraid of the politics." She drank her coffee. "I think we're all right." Ethan nodded. They sat together on the bench in the mid-morning quiet. After a while, Ethan said, "I meant what I said last night." She kept her eyes forward. "I know. I wasn't saying it because of the hearing. I know that too." Clara. She turned and looked at him, and in the full daylight outside the commission building with the case behind them, and the recess ticking away, and everything still uncertain, her face was the most open he had ever seen it. Not the curtain pulled back an inch. The curtain set aside entirely. "Ask me," she said. "After," he said. "I told you after." Something in her face was almost frustration, and almost amusement, and entirely warm. "Ethan Walker," she said, "you are the most stubborn man I have met in 36 years of living." "Probably," he said. She shook her head and looked back at the building, but she was almost smiling, and he was almost smiling, and that almost was its own kind of answer, the most honest kind. The kind that hadn't been rehearsed or prepared or constructed, just arrived in the space between 2 people sitting on a bench with coffee cups, waiting for their lives to resolve. The commission reconvened. Denby spoke for 11 minutes. He moved through the findings in order. The surveyor's conflict of interest was documented and constituted perjury in a sworn proceeding that would be referred to the Territorial Attorney General. The pattern of boundary claims across 4 properties, using the same compromised survey methodology and the same legal representative, constituted a coordinated scheme to defraud under territorial land law. The intimidation of Mrs. Alcott, while not actionable as a standalone complaint due to the indirect nature of the communication, was noted in the record as consistent with the broader pattern and would be included in the referral to the Attorney General. All boundary claims and pending filings by Nathaniel Crow Meridian. Land associates and associated parties were dismissed with prejudice. Ethan heard dismissed with prejudice and felt it land, and he looked at Clara. She was writing something in her notebook. Clara, he said. She kept writing. Clara. She stopped. She looked at him. We won, he said. She took a breath. One long, controlled breath that she let out slowly. We won, she said. He put his hand over hers on the table. She looked at his hand. She turned hers over and held it. Sure. Denby wasn't finished. Additionally, he said, and his voice had a quality now that was different from the procedural tone of the findings, something with weight in it, personal weight. This commission notes with particular commendation the quality and thoroughness of the complaint documentation presented by Miss Bennett. The timeline analysis, the cross-referencing of filings across jurisdictions, and the identification of the survey conflict of interest represent a standard of preparation that this commission does not commonly see, even from licensed legal representatives. Dean is so shy, sir. He looked at Clara directly. This commission would like to know, he said, whether Miss Bennett has considered pursuing formal legal credentials in this territory. The room, which had been quiet, went quieter. Clara was absolutely still. I have not, Commissioner, she said. Perhaps she should, Denby said, and looked back at his papers, as though he had simply made an administrative note, as though he hadn't just said something that Ethan was fairly certain was going to change something. Crow was gone before the building cleared. Ethan saw the empty chair and the closed door and understood that a man who had run when the editorial ran was not going to stand in a public room and face what had just happened. His lawyer was still at the table with his papers when Crow left, and Ethan watched Marsh sit there for a moment alone. A good attorney who had worked for a man who turned out to be exactly what Clara said he was, and there was something almost pitiable about it, except that Ethan had heard Marsh tell Mrs. Alcott that public hearings raised questions that were difficult to put back to rest, and he found the pity did not quite arrive. Outside, the Garrities shook Ethan's hand, and then Clara's hand, and old man Garrity held her hand in both of his for a moment and said, "Whatever I can do," and left it there open-ended, which was the Garrity version of a debt acknowledged. Mrs. Alcott found Clara near the building steps. She was small and straight, and her eyes were bright in a way that was not quite tears, and not quite not tears. "Will I get it back?" she said. "The land." "I'm going to look into it," Clara said. "The commission finding creates grounds for a civil claim. I can't promise, but I believe there's a real argument." She held the old woman's gaze. "I'm going to try." Mrs. Alcott nodded once. That's all I needed to hear. She went to find her daughter. Clara stood on the building steps and watched her go, and Ethan came and stood beside her, and he waited until Mrs. Alcott was in the carriage, and the carriage had pulled away before he said, "Are you going to do it?" What Denby said? She was quiet for a moment. "Legal credentials." "It's a long process," she said. "I know. It would mean going to Helena, not permanently, but I know that too." She looked at him. "You'd be on the ranch alone." "I managed before." "That's not exactly a ringing endorsement of the plan." He turned and faced her, which he did rarely. Usually he stood beside her or across a table from her, but he turned and faced her now, in the full daylight outside the commission building, where the case was won and the work was done, and there were no more things to manage or prepare or hold together. "Clara Bennett," he said. She looked at him. "I have been waiting to say this since the night before this hearing, and before that, since the night I sat on the porch after Holt told me what Sarah said, and before that, since you sat in the south pasture and diagnosed my cattle before I was out of bed." He stopped. Started again. "I wrote a letter asking for practical. For someone who would work. For someone I wouldn't feel anything about, because feeling things had cost me everything, and I wasn't going to pay that again." Her eyes were very steady on his. "You showed up," he said, "and you were everything I asked for, and everything I didn't ask for, and everything I didn't know I needed. And somewhere in the middle of a land fraud case, and 3 weeks of evidence and sitting on a porch in the dark, I fell in love with you." He said it plainly, the way she said everything directly without ornamentation, because she had taught him that the straightforward truth had more power than any arrangement of careful words. And I would like to know if you'll marry me. For real. Not arrangement. Not practical. Real. The afternoon was very still around them. Clara looked at him for a long time. The full reading look, the taking inventory look, the look he had watched her give to everything that mattered. Then she said, "I came here because of a letter from a man who was afraid to want too much." "I know. And I stayed because of the man I found when I got here." "Clara, yes," she said. Simply, "Yes, Ethan." He took her face in his hands carefully, the way you hold something you have been afraid to touch and are now touching. And she put her hands over his, and he kissed her there on the steps of the County Commission building, in front of Holt Briggs and Tom Briggs and Earl Poole and James Whitfield, the correspondent, and a significant portion of the county. And nobody said a word until Holt Briggs said, with the tone of a man who had waited 4 years and 8 months for something and was deeply satisfied, "About time." Tamade. They were married 3 weeks later. Not a large ceremony, not a long one. The Reverend from Silver Creek in the front room of the Walker Ranch, Holt and his wife as witnesses, Mrs. Alcott and the Garrities in chairs against the wall. Clara wore the green dress she'd arrived in, the one the color of pine needles cleaned and pressed, because she said it was the dress she'd worn when she chose this life, and she intended to wear it when she said so formally. Ethan wore his best coat and looked at her the way he'd been trying not to look at her for 5 weeks and no longer had to manage. When the Reverend asked if anyone knew, 'cause why these two should not be joined, Holt Briggs coughed, which was not because he had cause, but because he was Holt Briggs and could not resist. Ethan said, "Holt." Holt said, "No cause, I just had something in my throat." The Reverend said the words. Clara said the words back. Ethan said the words, and meant every one of them in the way that only a man means things who has lost everything once and knows exactly what he is holding. The territory caught up with Nathaniel Crow 6 months later in Billings, where he'd been operating under a different company name and had nearly completed a third water rights acquisition before the Attorney General's referral arrived and a federal marshal arrived with it. Clara heard the news from Whitfield, who wrote her a letter with the details in his quick recording hand. Crow was charged with fraud and perjury and 2 counts of intimidation of witnesses in a formal proceeding. Gerald Pruitt cooperated with the territorial attorney's investigation in exchange for reduced charges and lost his surveying license permanently. Leland Marsh's practice was formally censured. Mrs. Alcott recovered 4 acres of her original parcel in a civil settlement negotiated the following spring. Not all of it, but enough to matter, enough to be something back from what had been taken, and the negotiation was conducted by Clara Walker, who had begun the formal credentialing process at the territorial bar, and who was already, it turned out, better at it than most people who had been doing it for years. The ranch changed too, not all at once. Gradually, the way things change when the right conditions finally exist. The leak in the back bedroom wall was fixed, and the room became, in the year after the wedding, a room for a child again. The garden behind the house grew properly because it was tended. The table in the kitchen was always the table, never just a surface. The north pasture stayed whole. The cattle numbers climbed back. Holt Briggs came by at noon on Tuesdays and Fridays, which was more often than before, and he claimed it was because the coffee at the Walker Ranch had improved considerably, which was true, and everyone understood was not the whole reason. Earl Poole told the story to anyone who would listen. The stagecoach, the station platform. Ethan Walker saying that can't be her loud enough for a man 2 feet away to hear. He told it with the relish of a man present at something he knows will be told for a long time. And he was right about that, because Silver Creek told it for years. They told it about the woman who came off the stage with 1 suitcase and no pretensions, and within 3 weeks had built a legal case that ended a man's entire scheme and changed the course of land rights in that valley. They told it about the rancher who wrote a letter asking for the minimum and got something that had no bottom to it. They told it about the commission hearing and Mrs. Alcott's straight back and the surveyor who had to say yes and Leland Marsh sitting alone at his table after his client walked out the door. But the version that lasted, the one that people still told when they were trying to explain what they meant, when they said a person could surprise you, was simpler than all of that. It was the story of a man who had stopped believing in the future, and a woman who arrived with exactly the right amount of stubbornness to refuse to let him. And the moment on a station platform in Silver Creek, Montana in the summer of 1882, when a stagecoach door opened and a man said, "That can't be her." And she absolutely was. She was everything he'd been afraid to ask for, and she knew it, and she'd come anyway. On a Tuesday evening in the fall of the following year, Ethan Walker sat on the porch steps in the dark, the way he always had, boots off, eyes on the sky. But the porch door opened behind him, and Clara came out and sat beside him, not 2 steps below, not across a table beside him. And she had her coffee, and he had his. And the Montana night was wide above them, with more stars than any sky had a right to hold. "What are you thinking about?" she said. He thought about it honestly. "Nothing," he said, and meant it. Not the nothing of a man with too much silence. The nothing of a man who is exactly where he is supposed to be, with exactly who he is supposed to be with, and does not need to be anywhere else. Clara leaned her shoulder against his. He did not move away. The north pasture was dark and whole, and theirs, the cattle were in the house behind them, was warm and lit, and somewhere down the hall a room that had been closed for years was open again, full of the future instead of the past. Ethan Walker had come to that porch for years to be alone with his grief, and he had mistaken the aloneness for strength, and the grief for permanence. But love, it turned out, was not the thing that had cost him everything. Love was the thing that had given it back.